The sun sets slowly over the island of Crete, casting long shadows across ancient stones that have stood silent for more than 3,000 years. The Mediterranean breeze carries whispers of a civilization that once flourished here, a people whose very name was lost to time, buried beneath centuries of dust and forgotten memory. This is the story of the Minoans, Europe's first great civilization. A society so advanced, so sophisticated, that when archaeologists finally uncovered their remains at the beginning of the 20th century, the world could scarcely believe what had been hidden beneath the earth of this Greek island. Here, while much of Europe still lived in simple villages, the Minoans built multi-story palaces with running water and intricate drainage systems. They created art of breathtaking beauty. They sailed across the Mediterranean, trading with the great civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia. And then, mysteriously, they vanished. Tonight, we'll journey back 4,000 years to walk through their magnificent palaces, to understand their enigmatic religion, to witness their daily lives, and to explore the enduring mystery of their disappearance. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Birth of a Civilization. Before Athens, before Rome, before even the pyramids were old, there was a civilization on a small island that Europe forgot. To understand the Minoans, we must first travel much further back in time, to an era when Crete was home not to palace builders, but to simple farmers living in small villages scattered across the island's fertile valleys. The human story on Crete begins in the mists of the Neolithic period, the New Stone Age, around 7000 BCE. These first settlers arrived by boat from somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, perhaps from Anatolia or the Levant, bringing with them the revolutionary knowledge of agriculture. They carried seeds of wheat and barley, breeding pairs of sheep and goats, and the accumulated wisdom of farming that had originated in the Fertile Crescent and was slowly spreading across the Mediterranean world. These Neolithic Cretans built modest houses from mud, brick, and stone. They made pottery by hand, without the potter's wheel, decorating their vessels with simple geometric patterns. They crafted tools from stone and bone. Their lives revolved around the eternal rhythms of planting and harvest, the care of livestock, the making of food and clothing. Archaeological evidence suggests they buried their dead in caves, sometimes returning to these sacred spaces over generations, creating accumulations of bones and grave goods that speak of reverence for ancestors. For thousands of years, life on Crete continued in this fashion, relatively unchanged, villages dotting the landscape, people living much as their great-grandparents had lived. But around 3000 BCE, something began to shift. A new technology arrived on the island that would transform everything: the knowledge of metalworking, specifically the art of creating bronze. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was harder and more durable than stone. It could be cast into shapes impossible, with stone napping, allowing for better tools, more effective weapons, and entirely new forms of artistic expression. The Bronze Age, as we call this period, brought revolutionary changes to societies across the Mediterranean and Near East. And Crete, positioned at the crossroads of ancient trade routes, was perfectly placed to benefit from these innovations. The period from 3000 to 2100 BCE, which archaeologists call the early Minoan period, witnessed the gradual transformation of Crete from an island of Neolithic villages to something more complex and dynamic. Bronze tools and weapons began to appear in increasing numbers. The simple pottery of earlier times gave way to more sophisticated vessels, decorated with spirals, triangles, curved lines, crosses, and fishbone patterns. These designs show both creativity and an emerging sense of artistic tradition, as potters developed distinctive styles that would influence later Minoan art. The population grew steadily. Villages expanded, and new settlements appeared, particularly along the coasts where access to the sea offered opportunities for fishing and, increasingly, for trade. The Minoans were becoming seafarers, building boats capable of crossing the sometimes turbulent waters between Crete and neighboring islands and lands. Evidence from this period shows that Cretans were beginning to bury their dead in a distinctive type of tomb called a tholos, a circular stone structure with a domed or corbelled roof. These communal tombs served entire communities, with bodies and grave goods placed inside over generations. The dead were honoured but not separated by great distinctions of wealth or status. Early Minoan society appears to have been relatively egalitarian, without the stark hierarchies that would characterize later periods. Trade networks were forming. Obsidian, a volcanic glass prized for making sharp tools, arrived from the island of Melos. Emery, useful for polishing and grinding, came from Naxos. These exchanges connected Crete to the wider Aegean world. More distant connections were forming too. By the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, there is evidence of contact with the ancient civilizations of the eastern Mediterranean. Egyptian stone vessels have been found in Cretan contexts, and Cretan goods may have reached Egyptian shores. Skills were developing. Minoan craftspeople began creating elaborate stone seals, small carved objects used to mark ownership or authenticate documents. These seals, often bearing intricate designs of animals or geometric patterns, demonstrate remarkable artistic skill and hint at increasingly complex systems of property and administration. Metalworking advanced from simple copper objects to true bronze, requiring the import of tin from distant sources, probably from Anatolia or even further east. By around 2300 BCE, larger settlements were emerging at sites that would later become palace centers. At Knossos, Phaistos, and Mallia, we see evidence of more substantial architecture, public buildings that served communal purposes, concentrations of craft production. Society was becoming more stratified, more organized, more complex. Something was building. The scattered villages of the Neolithic were evolving into something new. Trade was bringing not just goods, but ideas, technologies, and ambitions. The population was growing. Wealth was accumulating. Skills were advancing. All the pieces were falling into place for a dramatic transformation. The transformation came around 1900 BCE, at the beginning of what archaeologists call the PROTOPALATIAL period, the era of the first palaces. The decades around 2000 BCE saw dramatic changes across Crete. At several sites simultaneously, populations surged. At Knossos in the north-central region, at Phaistos on the southern Mizara plain, and at Mallia on the northern coast, settlements that had been merely large villages suddenly exploded in size and ambition. Major construction projects began. These weren't simple expansions of existing buildings, but something entirely new, the creation of monumental architectural complexes that we call palaces. The term palace might be slightly misleading, suggesting primarily royal residences, when in fact these structures served multiple functions. They were administrative centers, religious sanctuaries, storage facilities for agricultural surplus, workshops for craft production, and yes, quite possibly residences for elite families. They were, in essence, the nerve centers of increasingly complex societies. The first palaces were substantial structures, built around rectangular central courtyards, with rooms arranged in organized fashion around them. They featured impressive masonry, with large blocks of stone carefully fitted together. The courtyards themselves were paved, creating formal spaces for gatherings, ceremonies, and public events. Surrounding rooms included storage magazines filled with enormous clay jars called pithoi, workshops where craftspeople produced pottery and other goods, and shrine rooms for religious activities. The construction of these palaces represents more than just architectural achievement. It signals a fundamental reorganization of Minoan society. The resources and labor required to build such structures could only have been mobilized by some form of centralized authority. The storage of agricultural surplus suggests systems of taxation or tribute. The administrative spaces point to record-keeping and bureaucracy. The religious areas indicate that ritual and spiritual life were becoming formalized and connected to these centers of power. We see, in other words, the emergence of what we might call states, or at least proto-states. Crete was no longer simply a collection of independent villages. Instead, palace centers were exerting control over surrounding territories, organizing economic life, conducting religious ceremonies, and managing trade with the outside world. The pottery of this period, known as Kamares ware after the cave where it was first discovered, shows the artistic flowering that accompanied these social changes. Kamares ware is breathtakingly beautiful, featuring light-colored designs painted on dark backgrounds with flowing spirals, floral motifs, and abstract patterns that seem to dance across the surface of vessels. This pottery was so prized that it was exported across the eastern Mediterranean. Examples have been found in Egypt, testimony to Minoan trade connections with the great civilization of the Nile. And here we must pause to consider what life was like for the Minoans of this period, around 1900 to 1700 BCE, during the Protopalatial era. For most people, life still centered on agriculture. The majority of Cretans were farmers, tending olive groves, vineyards, and fields of wheat and barley. They raised sheep and goats, pigs and cattle. The Mediterranean climate was kind to such endeavors, with mild winters and hot, dry summers. The olive harvest in autumn, the grape harvest in late summer, the grain harvest in early summer, these rhythms structured the year. But increasingly, people's lives were connected to the palaces. Farmers brought their surplus produce to palace storerooms, receiving in return protection, organization, and access to goods from distant lands. Craftspeople worked in palace workshops, creating pottery, textiles, metalwork under the direction of palace administrators. Merchants conducted trade using palace resources and operating under palace authority. The palaces conducted elaborate religious ceremonies, likely at key moments in the agricultural year, festivals that brought communities together in shared ritual. We can imagine processions moving through palace corridors, priestesses and priests conducting sacred rites, offerings made to deities whose names we'll never know. Social stratification was increasing. An elite class associated with the palaces was emerging, families who controlled resources and directed activities. But compared to contemporary societies in Egypt or Mesopotamia, Minoan society seems to have remained relatively fluid. We find no evidence of despotic kings demanding absolute obedience, no monumental tombs for rulers, no iconography showing monarchs receiving tribute from subjugated peoples. The Minoans developed hierarchy, but apparently not tyranny. Trade was expanding dramatically. Minoan ships, propelled by both oars and square sails, voyaged across the Mediterranean. They carried Cretan olive oil, wine, and manufactured goods to Egypt, where Minoans are actually depicted in Egyptian tomb paintings, bringing gifts to pharaohs. They traded with Cyprus for copper, essential for bronze production. They reached the Syrian coast, exchanging goods with the sophisticated societies of the Levant. They visited the Aegean Islands and the coast of Anatolia. This trade brought not just material goods, but cultural exchange. Egyptian artistic motifs began influencing Minoan art. Near Eastern cylinder seals inspired Minoan seal-making. But the exchange flowed both ways. Minoan artistic styles influenced the Cycladic islands. Minoan pottery appeared in foreign lands, carrying with it Cretan aesthetic sensibilities. The Minoans were developing their own distinctive culture, neither simply derivative of Eastern civilizations nor isolated from them. They were creating something unique, a Mediterranean civilization with its own character, its own artistic vision, its own way of organizing society and relating to the divine. Writing appeared during this period. The Cretans developed at first a hieroglyphic script, using pictographic symbols to record information. Later, they created Linear A, a more abstract script that seems to have evolved from the earlier hieroglyphs. These writing systems allowed for more sophisticated record-keeping, essential for palace administration. Unfortunately, despite numerous attempts, Linear A has never been deciphered. The language remains unknown, the records unreadable. It's one of the great frustrations of Minoan archaeology that we have their written documents but cannot understand them. For 2 centuries, the Protopalatial period continued. The palaces grew in size and importance. Trade flourished. Art developed in sophistication and beauty. The population increased. Minoan civilization was finding its stride, establishing patterns and traditions that would characterize it for centuries to come. Then, around 1700 BCE, disaster struck. Earthquakes, perhaps accompanied by fires, destroyed the palaces. Knossos, Phaistos, Malia, all the major centers were devastated. Archaeological layers show clear evidence of violent destruction. Walls collapsed. Rooms were buried under rubble. It must have been catastrophic for those who experienced it, their great buildings reduced to ruins, their careful organization thrown into chaos. But the Minoans did not despair. Instead, they did something remarkable. They rebuilt. Not just rebuilding what had been lost, but creating something even more magnificent. The destruction of 1700 BCE marked not the end of Minoan civilization, but the transition to its greatest period, the Neopalatial era, the time of the new palaces, when Minoan culture would reach heights of achievement that still astonish us today. From disaster, they forged renewal. From ruins, they built glory. The stage was set for the golden age of the Minoans. Chapter 2. The Palace Civilization, Protopalatial Period. Before we move forward into the golden age of the Neopalatial period, let us pause and step inside these remarkable structures that defined Minoan civilization. Let us walk through a Minoan palace, understand its architecture, imagine its functions, and contemplate what these buildings tell us about the people who built and inhabited them. Picture yourself approaching the palace at Knossos on a warm Mediterranean morning around 1800 BCE during the Protopalatial period. You're walking along one of the paved roads that connect the palace to surrounding settlements, a remarkable feature in itself. Most Bronze Age peoples walked on dirt paths, but the Minoans built stone roads, engineering infrastructure that speaks to organization and ambition. As you draw near, the palace rises before you, a sprawling complex of buildings arranged around a vast central courtyard. The walls are constructed of large limestone blocks, fitted together with impressive precision. Some walls are covered with plaster, painted in vibrant colors, reds and yellows and blues that gleam in the sunlight. You see columns, distinctive columns that taper downward, wider at the top than at the bottom, painted in bright red with black capitals. These columns will become an iconic feature of Minoan architecture, copied but never quite matched by later cultures. You enter through one of several porticos, covered walkways with columns supporting the roof. The entrance is impressive but not intimidating. Unlike the fortress palaces of the Mycenaeans or the monumental gateways of Near Eastern cities, Minoan palaces are relatively open and welcoming. There are no massive defensive walls, no towers bristling with weapons, no narrow passages designed to slow attackers. This openness tells us something important. The Minoans, at least during their peak, did not live in fear of invasion. They felt secure, protected perhaps by their island position and their naval power. You step into the central courtyard, and suddenly you understand the scale and organization of this place. The courtyard is enormous, roughly 170 feet long and 90 feet wide, oriented precisely north to south. The long axis runs north-south, which would have maximized sunlight and aligned important western rooms toward the rising sun. This wasn't accidental. The Minoans were careful planners, incorporating astronomical and topographical considerations into their architecture. The courtyard is paved with large stone slabs, creating a firm, level surface. This was the heart of palace life, the stage for ceremonies and gatherings. You can imagine processions moving through this space, priestesses in elaborate costumes leading rituals, officials conducting public business, crowds gathering for religious festivals. The courtyard connects all parts of the palace, with doorways and staircases leading off in all directions. To your west rises the formal wing of the palace, with its shrine rooms and ceremonial spaces. The western facade facing the courtyard is impressive, with a series of doorways and windows arranged in careful symmetry. Behind this facade lie the most sacred and important areas of the palace. Storage magazines run along the western side, long narrow rooms filled with enormous clay jars, pithoi, some taller than a person. These massive vessels held the palace's wealth: olive oil, wine, grain, honey, and other foodstuffs. Some pithoi could hold more than 200 gallons. The concentration of stored goods in these magazines tells us about the palace's economic role. Surplus from surrounding agricultural lands flowed into these storerooms, and from here it was redistributed, supporting palace personnel, funding trade expeditions, providing for festivals and ceremonies. The western wing also contains shrine rooms, spaces set aside for religious activities. These rooms are smaller, more intimate than the grand courtyard. Some have raised platforms that may have supported cult statues. Others contain distinctive features like pillar crypts, underground chambers with massive pillars that seem to have had sacred significance. The Minoans appear to have believed that certain architectural elements, particularly pillars and columns, possessed religious meaning, perhaps serving as conduits between the human and divine realms. The throne room, though it reaches its final form only in the later Neopalatial period, already exists in some form. A chair carved from stone sits against a wall, surrounded by benches. Frescoes, though damaged, show griffins, mythical creatures with lion bodies and eagle heads flanking the throne. Was this where a king sat? A high priestess? A council of elders? We cannot be certain. Minoan iconography, strangely, shows us no clear kings, no obvious rulers. Unlike Egyptian pharaohs or Mesopotamian monarchs, Minoan leaders remain anonymous in their art. This continues to puzzle scholars. The eastern wing of the palace served different functions, more domestic and residential. Here the architecture becomes more intimate, with smaller rooms arranged around light wells, open shafts that brought sunlight and air into interior spaces. This is where the grand staircase impresses most dramatically. Multiple flights of steps, built around a central light well, connected 4 or more stories of the palace. Even today, partially reconstructed by Arthur Evans, this staircase astonishes visitors with its engineering and elegance. Imagine climbing these steps in ancient times, light streaming down from above, the walls around you decorated with colourful frescoes. The residential quarters contained what we might recognize as apartments, suites of rooms with sleeping chambers, sitting areas, and private bathrooms. Yes, bathrooms. The Minoans had developed remarkably sophisticated plumbing systems. Clay pipes carried water through the palace, with sections that fit together snugly, allowing for joints and turns. Some pipes were tapered, which actually increased water pressure as it flowed downhill, a principle of hydraulic engineering that wouldn't be fully understood again until modern times. Drains carried away wastewater, running beneath floors and through walls to exit the palace into larger sewage channels. Some toilets had flushing systems, with water from clay pipes washing waste into the drains below. This wasn't primitive. This was advanced urban engineering, creating sanitary conditions far superior to what most ancient peoples, and indeed most medieval Europeans, would experience. The ventilation system was equally impressive. Light wells didn't just provide illumination. They created air circulation, with the differential heating of air in the shafts, drawing fresh air through the palace and expelling stale air. In the hot Cretan summers, this natural air conditioning kept interior spaces remarkably cool. The Minoans understood their climate and worked with it, creating comfortable living conditions through intelligent design rather than brute force. Throughout the palace, frescoes decorated the walls. Though many have been lost or damaged over the millennia, enough survived to show us the Minoan aesthetic. The paintings are vibrant, full of movement and life. Human figures appear slender and graceful, women in elaborate flounced skirts and fitted bodices, their hair in intricate curls, their gestures elegant and purposeful. Men, painted in darker tones following the convention of Mediterranean art, appear in loincloths, their bodies lithe and athletic. But unlike Egyptian art with its rigid formality, Minoan figures seem to move, to dance, to live. They gather flowers, leap over bulls, participate in ceremonies, converse with each other. The scenes pulse with energy. Nature appears everywhere in Minoan frescoes. Dolphins leap through painted seas. Flying fish arc through blue spaces. Flowers bloom in abundance. Lilies and crocuses and papyrus plants. Gardens appear, lush and idealized, perhaps representing sacred landscapes or paradisiacal visions. Birds flit among the vegetation. Monkeys, imported from Egypt or imagined from travelers' tales, swing through painted groves. The Minoans clearly loved the natural world and sought to bring its beauty inside their buildings. But what actually happened in these palaces? What were they for? This question has occupied scholars for decades, and the answer appears to be many things. The palaces were multifunctional centers that served economic, religious, administrative, and social purposes. Economically, the palaces operated as collection and redistribution centers. Agricultural surplus from surrounding territories came to the palace storerooms. Craftspeople worked in palace workshops, producing goods under palace direction or using palace-supplied materials. The palace then redistributed these resources, supporting its personnel, funding religious activities, conducting trade, and perhaps providing for the population during times of shortage. This system, sometimes called a palace economy, wasn't unique to the Minoans. Similar patterns existed in Bronze Age societies across the Mediterranean and Near East. But the Minoans developed their own distinctive version, one that seems to have been relatively efficient and prosperous. Religiously, the palaces served as major ceremonial centers. The sacred spaces within the palace, the great courtyard suitable for public rituals, the shrine rooms for more intimate ceremonies, all point to religion as a central palace function. Priestesses and priests, possibly drawn from elite families, conducted elaborate rituals. Objects found in palace contexts include libation vessels for pouring liquid offerings, figurines of deities or worshippers, double axes that seem to have had sacred significance, and horns of consecration, stylized bull horns that marked sacred spaces. The palace wasn't just an administrative building. It was a temple, a place where the human and divine realms intersected. Administratively, the palaces clearly served as governmental centers. The Linear A tablets found in palace contexts are primarily economic records, inventories of goods, lists of personnel, records of transactions. This paperwork, or claywork rather, required scribes, trained specialists who could read and write. It required administrators who organized activities, made decisions about resource allocation, directed labor. The palaces housed bureaucracies, systems of record-keeping and management that allowed for increasingly complex social organization. Socially, the palaces were community centers. The great courtyards hosted gatherings that brought people together. Religious festivals celebrated at the palace created shared experiences and reinforced communal identity. The palace's economic activities, its workshops and storerooms, its trade expeditions and craft production, provided employment and purpose for many people. The palace was where things happened, where the life of the community focused and intensified. Were the palaces also residences for rulers? Probably, though this remains uncertain. The residential quarters certainly suggest elite habitation. Someone important lived in those well-appointed rooms with their private bathrooms and painted walls. But whether these were kings in any conventional sense, whether power was hereditary or achieved through other means, whether single rulers controlled each palace or councils of elite families shared authority, these questions remain frustratingly unclear. What is clear is that Minoan palaces, unlike contemporary Bronze Age palaces elsewhere, do not glorify military power or emphasize the ruler's absolute authority. There are no scenes of kings smiting enemies, no monumental statues of monarchs, no inscriptions proclaiming royal greatness. Minoan palace art shows religious ceremonies, natural beauty, athletic activities, elegant courtiers, but not military conquest or royal domination. This is remarkable and suggests that Minoan political culture may have been significantly different from that of Egypt or Mesopotamia. The palace at Knossos was the largest and apparently most important of the protopalatial centers, but it was not alone. At Phaistos, on the Mycenaean plain in southern Crete, another impressive palace complex oversaw the rich agricultural lands of the south. The palace at Phaistos shared the basic organizational principles of Knossos with its central courtyard and surrounding wings, but possessed its own architectural character and probably its own independent political authority. At Malea, on the northern coast east of Knossos, a third major palace served as the center for that region. Malea's palace, perhaps somewhat less elaborate than Knossos or Phaistos, nonetheless featured the signature elements of Minoan palace architecture and clearly functioned as a major center of power and activity. A fourth palace at Zakros, on the eastern tip of Crete, seems to have been particularly involved in maritime trade with the east. Its location made it a natural point of contact with Cyprus, the Levantine coast, and Egypt. The wealth found at Zakros, including imported ivory, copper ingots, and luxury goods, testifies to its role in Minoan commercial networks. These palaces, along with smaller elite residences sometimes called villas, scattered across the Cretan landscape, formed a network of centers that organized Minoan society during the protopalatial period. They were connected by those paved roads, by economic ties, by shared religious practices and artistic traditions, and quite possibly by kinship relations among elite families. But were they unified under a single political authority? Did one palace, presumably Knossos, rule over the others? Or did each palace control its own territory as an independent small state? This question, like so many regarding Minoan political organization, remains open to debate. The evidence could support either interpretation. What seems clear is that whether unified or not, the palace centers shared enough in common, culturally and economically, to make Minoan Crete a coherent civilization rather than simply a collection of unrelated communities. Life during the Protopalatial period, for those fortunate enough to live near or work for a palace, must have been relatively prosperous and secure. Crete was fertile, producing abundant crops. Trade brought exotic goods and new ideas. The palaces organized labor and resources efficiently. Religious life provided meaning and community. Artistic production flourished, with craftspeople creating objects of remarkable beauty. Yet we should not romanticize. Most Cretans were farmers living in small villages. Their lives focused on the hard work of agriculture, their connection to the palaces consisting primarily of delivering surplus and participating occasionally in palace festivals. Life expectancy was short by modern standards. Infant mortality was high. Disease and injury, without modern medicine, could be deadly. The palace's prosperity rested on the labor of many, and the wealth they accumulated was not evenly distributed. Still, by the standards of the Bronze Age, the Minoans during the Protopalatial period achieved something remarkable. They built a sophisticated civilization without the apparent militarism of other contemporary societies. They created art that celebrated beauty and nature, rather than warfare and conquest. They developed systems of government and economy that supported thousands of people across an entire island. They connected Crete to the wider Mediterranean world while maintaining their own distinctive cultural identity. The Protopalatial period laid the foundations for what was to come. The architectural forms were established. The economic systems were functioning. The trade networks were operating. The artistic traditions were maturing. Religious practices were being codified. Administrative techniques were being refined. Everything was in place. And then, around 1700 BCE, the earthquakes came. The palaces fell, but from their ruins would rise something even greater. The Neopalatial period, the golden age of the Minoans, was about to begin. The story continues as Minoan civilization reaches for its zenith. Chapter 3. The Golden Age, Neopalatial period. Around 1700 BCE, the earth shook. Across Crete, the palaces that had stood for 2 centuries trembled and collapsed. Walls cracked and fell. Roofs caved in. Fires broke out in the chaos, consuming what the earthquakes had damaged. At Knossos, at Phaistos, at Malia, at Zakros, destruction was widespread and devastating. Archaeological layers show the violence of this moment. Rooms buried under rubble, valuable objects crushed beneath fallen stones, the careful order of palace life suddenly thrown into chaos. We cannot know what the Minoans thought as they stood among the ruins of their great buildings. Did they despair? Did they see it as divine punishment? Did they question whether their civilization could survive such catastrophe? Whatever their thoughts, their actions spoke clearly. They would rebuild. Not just restore what had been lost, but create something grander, more magnificent, more beautiful than before. The determination to rebuild after the destructions of 1700 BCE reveals something essential about Minoan character. They were resilient, ambitious, and confident. Rather than retreating in the face of disaster, they saw opportunity. The new palaces, the structures they built on the ruins of the old, would be larger, more elaborate, more architecturally sophisticated. This was not mere reconstruction. This was Renaissance. The Neopalatial period, from approximately 1700 to 1450 BCE, represents the absolute peak of Minoan civilization. These 2.5 centuries saw achievements in art, architecture, trade, and cultural influence that make the Minoans worthy of remembrance 4,000 years later. This was their golden age, their moment of greatest glory. Let us watch as the new palaces rise from the rubble of the old. At Knossos, the reconstruction was ambitious and transformative. The new palace followed the same basic plan as its predecessor, centered on the great courtyard, but everything was bigger, more refined, more impressive. The western wing was expanded, with even more storage magazines holding even larger pithoi. The residential quarters in the eastern wing grew more elaborate, with additional stories added to the grand staircase, creating a truly multi-story complex that must have dominated the surrounding landscape. New features appeared throughout the palace. The throne room took on its final, magnificent form, with the stone throne still visible today, flanked by benches and surrounded by frescoes of griffins rendered in stunning detail. These mythical creatures with their leonine bodies and eagle heads, served as guardians, their painted eyes watching over whoever sat upon that throne. The facades became more impressive, with elegant porticos and carefully proportioned columns, creating a sense of monumentality without oppressiveness. The Minoan architectural aesthetic was distinctive, favoring grace over mass, elegance over intimidation. Where Egyptian temples overwhelmed with sheer size and Mesopotamian ziggurats reached toward heaven through brute accumulation of brick, Minoan palaces achieved their effect through proportion, color, light, and sophisticated design. The plumbing systems were enhanced. Water supply became more reliable, with aqueducts bringing fresh water from distant springs. The drainage systems were expanded and improved. Private bathrooms multiplied. One bathroom in the residential quarters featured a clay bathtub, painted decoratively, with a drain that carried away used water. Another room appears to have contained a flushing toilet, with water channels designed to wash waste into the sewage system below. The engineering knowledge required for these systems was remarkable, involving understanding of hydraulics, of slope and flow, of materials and construction techniques. At Phaistos, the new palace followed a similar pattern of expansion and refinement. The site took advantage of its dramatic hillside location, with the palace terraced into the slope, offering commanding views over the Mazara plain. The ceremonial staircase at Phaistos, ascending to the central courtyard, created a processional approach of great dignity and power. One can imagine religious processions climbing these steps, priestesses and officials ascending toward the sacred spaces above, observed by crowds gathered in the lower court. Malia's new palace incorporated innovative features, including what appears to have been a ceremonial platform in the central courtyard, perhaps for public displays of ritual or authority. At Zakros, the rebuilt palace expanded the workshops and storage areas, reflecting its continued importance in maritime trade. New palaces also appeared at sites that had not previously had them, including Galatas in the north-central region, suggesting a flourishing of palace culture across the island. But the neopalatial palaces were not just bigger versions of what came before. They represented a maturing of Minoan architectural philosophy, a confidence and sophistication that created spaces of remarkable beauty and functionality. The integration of light and air, the flow between indoor and outdoor spaces, the use of color and decoration, the attention to both grand public areas and intimate private rooms, all of this speaks to architects who understood not just construction but the creation of meaningful, livable spaces. It was during the neopalatial period that Minoan art reached its zenith, achieving a level of sophistication and beauty that still astonishes modern viewers. The frescoes that decorated palace walls in this era are among the most celebrated artworks of the ancient world. Unlike the formal, stylized art of Egypt, or the powerful but often crude art of earlier periods, Minoan frescoes burst with life, movement, and naturalism. Consider the famous bull-leaping fresco from Knossos. Against a blue background, 3 figures interact with a charging bull. One figure, painted white following the convention for female figures, grasps the bull's horns. Another, painted red-brown indicating male, is caught mid-somersault over the bull's back, body arched in a perfect curve of athletic grace. A third figure, female again, stands behind the bull with arms outstretched, ready to catch or steady the leaper. The bull itself is rendered with careful attention to anatomy and movement, muscles defined, head lowered, hooves thundering across the painted ground. The scene captures a moment of intense action, frozen in time yet somehow still moving. This was not easy to achieve. The artists had to understand anatomy, perspective, motion, composition. They had to mix pigments that would remain vibrant, apply them to wet plaster so the paint bonded with the wall surface as it dried, work quickly before the plaster set. The technical skill required was immense, and the Minoan fresco painters possessed it in abundance. Other frescoes show different aspects of Minoan life and imagination. The dolphin fresco, found in what may have been a queen's apartment, depicts these graceful marine mammals swimming through a painted sea, surrounded by fish and sea urchins. The blue of the water, the fluid motion of the dolphins, the scattered marine life, all create an underwater scene of remarkable beauty and peace. Looking at it, one feels the Mediterranean world that the Minoans knew and loved. The Prince of the Lilies fresco, though heavily restored by Arthur Evans and now questioned in some of its details, shows a young male figure crowned with lilies and peacock feathers, walking through a field of flowers. Whether this represents a prince, a priest, or even a composite of fragments incorrectly assembled, the surviving authentic portions show the Minoan love of floral decoration and elegant human figures. The Parisian fresco, named for its subject's supposedly Parisian chic by early excavators, depicts a female face in profile with elaborately curled dark hair, large eyes, and delicate features. She wears what appears to be a sacred knot at the back of her neck, suggesting a priestess or deity. Her expression is enigmatic, her bearing dignified and confident. Procession frescoes show lines of elegant figures carrying offerings, perhaps participating in religious ceremonies. These figures wear elaborate costumes, the women in flounced skirts with exposed breasts, tight waists, and ornate jewelry, the men in kilts or loincloths with codpieces. Their hair is styled in complex arrangements of curls and braids. They move with grace and purpose, part of rituals we can only dimly imagine. Nature appears constantly in neopalatial art. Not just dolphins and fish, but flowers everywhere. Lilies, crocuses, papyrus plants, all rendered with botanical accuracy, yet stylized into decorative patterns. Gardens appear, perhaps sacred groves or idealized landscapes. Birds flit through painted vegetation. Monkeys, exotic creatures from Egypt or Africa, appear in some frescoes, swinging through gardens in scenes that mix observation with imagination. Pottery reached new heights during the Neopalatial period. The marine-style pottery, produced during the 15th century BCE, ranks among the finest ceramic art ever created. These vessels, typically storage jars and ritual containers, are covered with sea creatures rendered in dark paint on light backgrounds. Octopuses spread their tentacles across the curving surfaces of jars, their forms perfectly adapted to the vessel shape. Nautiluses spiral in elegant curves. Fish swim in painted seas. Coral, seaweed, shells, all the denizens of the Mediterranean depths, appear in stylized but recognizable form. What makes marine-style pottery so remarkable is the way the decoration responds to and enhances the vessel form. The artists understood that they were decorating three-dimensional objects, not flat surfaces. The octopus tentacles curve around the jar, flowing with its shape. The nautilus spirals echo the vessel's curves. This is sophisticated artistic thinking, showing deep understanding of form, space, and decoration. Other pottery styles flourished as well. Floral-style vessels covered surfaces with flowers and plants. Palace-style pottery, used for important ceremonial vessels, featured more formal, hieratic decoration, often including sacred symbols like double axes and horns of consecration. The variety and quality of Neopalatial pottery testify to numerous workshops with skilled craftspeople producing for both local use and export. Sculpture, though less monumental than in some other ancient cultures, showed remarkable skill in small-scale work. The famous snake goddess figurines, found in a shrine at Knossos, depict female figures with bare breasts, elaborate flounced skirts, and snakes held in their outstretched hands or wound around their bodies. Whether these represent goddesses, priestesses, or worshippers remains debated, but their craftsmanship is undeniable. The detail of costume, the confident modeling of the human form, the sense of presence these small figures convey, all speak to sculptors of considerable ability. Stone vessels carved from colored marbles and other stones displayed both technical and artistic mastery. Some vessels are simple in form, but beautiful in material, the natural veining and color of the stone providing the decoration. Others are carved with elaborate relief decoration, figures and patterns standing out from the vessel surface. The bird's nest vase, carved from black steatite, shows eggs in a nest, rendered with remarkable naturalism and delicacy. Metalwork reached new levels of sophistication. Gold jewelry from Neopalatial contexts includes pieces of breathtaking delicacy. Filigree work, using thin wires of gold arranged in intricate patterns, created jewelry of gossamer lightness. Granulation, the technique of decorating gold surfaces with tiny spheres of gold, produced jewelry with texture and visual interest. Pendant bees, found at Malea, show two bees holding a honeycomb, their wings spread, their bodies rendered in careful detail. The piece is small, just a few inches across, but perfect in its execution. Seal stones, used to mark ownership and authenticate documents, became miniature art galleries, Carved from semi-precious stones like carnelian, agate, and jasper, these tiny objects bear incredibly detailed scenes. Animals appear frequently: bulls, goats, lions, griffins, all carved with careful attention to anatomy and movement. Human figures engage in various activities. Religious symbols abound. The carving was done with simple tools, probably bronze points and abrasive powders, yet the results show precision and artistry that modern gem cutters respect and sometimes struggle to match. What characterized Neopalatial art was not just technical skill, though that was certainly present, but a distinctive aesthetic sensibility. Minoan art celebrated life, movement, beauty, and nature. It was not primarily concerned with glorifying rulers or depicting warfare, the subjects that dominated much ancient art. Instead, Minoan artists chose to show religious ceremonies, natural beauty, athletic activities, and elegant people in beautiful costumes. There is a joy in Minoan art, a sense that the world is beautiful and worth celebrating. The frescoes don't show battles or executions. The pottery doesn't glorify military conquest. The seals rarely depict violence. This doesn't mean the Minoans were naive or pacifistic. They surely knew conflict, competition, and hardship. But they chose not to make these things central to their artistic expression. This choice tells us something about Minoan values and worldview. They valued grace over force, beauty over intimidation, harmony with nature over domination of it. Their art suggests a civilization that, at its peak, felt secure enough to celebrate rather than threaten, confident enough to create beauty rather than displays of power. During the Neopalatial period, evidence suggests that Minoan society achieved a remarkable degree of administrative and economic unity across Crete. While scholars debate whether this unity was political, with Knossos ruling the entire island, or simply economic and cultural, the archaeological evidence shows unprecedented coordination and standardization. The Linear A script spread to palace sites across the island, with tablets showing similar accounting practices and organizational systems. This suggests either centralized control or at least widespread adoption of common administrative methods. Pottery styles became more uniform across Crete, indicating either centralized production and distribution or cultural unity that encouraged similar tastes. The road network expanded, connecting all major palace centers and many smaller settlements, facilitating movement of goods, people, and ideas. The population of Crete appears to have reached its Bronze Age peak during the Neopalatial period. Towns and villages dotted the landscape. The palace centers themselves grew substantially. Knossos may have been home to 10,000 or more people, a substantial city by Bronze Age standards. The island as a whole may have supported a population of several 100,000, impressive for an island of Crete's size. This population was supported by intensive agriculture. Olive groves covered hillsides. Vineyards produced grapes for wine. Fields of wheat and barley stretched across fertile plains. Sheep and goats grazed on marginal lands. The agricultural surplus flowing into palace storerooms was substantial, providing the economic foundation for the civilization's achievements in art, architecture, and trade. Craft specialization increased. Archaeological evidence shows workshops dedicated to specific crafts: pottery production, textile weaving, metalworking, stone vessel carving. Some craftspeople worked in palace workshops under palace direction. Others operated independently, selling their products through markets or directly to consumers. The proliferation of high-quality crafted goods suggests a thriving economy with demand for luxury items as well as everyday necessities. Trade reached its greatest extent during the Neopalatial period. Minoan pottery has been found across the eastern Mediterranean, from Egypt to the Levantine coast, from Cyprus to the Aegean Islands, from mainland Greece to southern Italy. This pottery was not simply lost by Minoan travelers. It was valued and acquired by foreign peoples, testimony to Minoan craftsmanship and commercial reach. The Minoans exported not just pottery but olive oil, wine, textiles, metal goods, and perhaps most importantly, expertise. Minoan craftspeople traveled abroad, working for foreign patrons. Minoan fresco painters decorated palaces in Egypt and the Levantine coast, bringing their distinctive style to foreign lands. This export of skilled labor and artistic knowledge spread Minoan influence even where Minoan goods did not reach. In return, Crete imported the raw materials it lacked. Copper came from Cyprus, essential for bronze production. Tin, even rarer, came from distant sources, possibly Anatolia or even further east, perhaps ultimately from Afghanistan. Gold and silver arrived from various sources. Ivory from Syria or Egypt provided material for carved luxury goods. Exotic stones for seals and vessels came from around the Mediterranean. This import trade connected the Minoans to distant lands and made them dependent on maintaining peaceful, profitable relationships with trading partners. Minoan influence spread beyond trade goods. The Cycladic islands, scattered across the Aegean between Crete and mainland Greece, show strong Minoan cultural influence during the Neopalatial period. At Akrotiri, on the island of Thera, a settlement that would later be buried by volcanic eruption, we find a essentially Minoan town, with frescoes in Minoan style, pottery following Minoan models, architecture reflecting Minoan principles. Whether this was a Minoan colony, a Cycladic town adopting Minoan culture, or something in between remains debated, but the Minoan cultural presence is undeniable. On mainland Greece, the emerging Mycenaean civilization was strongly influenced by Minoan models. The Mycenaeans adopted Minoan artistic styles, borrowed Minoan religious symbols, learned from Minoan architecture. In their early development, the Mycenaeans were, in many ways, students of the Minoans, though they would develop their own distinctive, more militaristic culture. The Minoans, it seemed, had achieved something remarkable. Without building a military empire, without conquering neighbors, without the aggressive expansionism that characterized many ancient civilizations, they had spread their influence across the eastern Mediterranean through trade, craftsmanship, and cultural appeal. Their art was admired and imitated. Their goods were desired. Their expertise was sought after. This was soft power, influence through attraction rather than coercion. The Neopalatial period, from 1700 to about 1450 BCE, represented the fullest flowering of Minoan civilization. The palaces had reached their greatest extent and sophistication. Art had achieved its highest development. Trade networks spanned the Mediterranean. The population was large and apparently prosperous. Cultural influence radiated outward from Crete. Everything seemed to be working, all the elements of a successful Bronze Age civilization operating in harmony. But this golden age, brilliant as it was, would not last. Forces were building, both natural and human, that would bring an end to the Neopalatial period and transform Minoan civilization forever. In the north, on the island of Thera, a volcano was awakening. On mainland Greece, the Mycenaeans were growing stronger, more organized, more ambitious. And on Crete itself, perhaps internal stresses were accumulating, strains that prosperity could mask but not eliminate. The peak had been reached. What comes after a peak is descent. The story of the Minoans was about to enter its tragic phase, the beginning of the end of their independence and glory. But before we turn to that darker chapter, let us pause and appreciate what the Neopalatial Minoans achieved. They created beauty. They built with skill and vision. They traded peacefully across the Mediterranean. They developed a culture that, even across 4,000 years, speaks to us of grace, elegance, and the love of life. Whatever came after, whatever disasters and invasions awaited them, they had this golden age, these 2.5 centuries when everything seemed possible and the future stretched bright before them. The palaces stood proud. The frescoes glowed with colour. The pottery gleamed. The ships sailed. The ceremonies continued. For a time, for a brief, shining time, the Minoans lived their best lives, creating a civilization worthy of remembrance. Chapter 4. Religion and Ritual, the Sacred World. To understand the Minoans, we must step beyond their palaces and art, beyond their trade networks and administrative systems, into the realm of the sacred. For the Minoans, as for all ancient peoples, religion was not a separate sphere of life, but woven into everything they did. Their palaces were temples as much as administrative centers. Their art depicted not just beauty but sacred mysteries. Their very understanding of the cosmos, of their place in the world, was fundamentally religious. Yet Minoan religion remains one of the most mysterious aspects of their civilization. We have no religious texts, no prayers or hymns written in a language we can understand. The linear A tablets are administrative records, not theological treatises. What we know of Minoan religion comes from archaeology, from the objects they left behind, the spaces they created for worship, the images they carved and painted. From these silent witnesses, we must reconstruct their spiritual world, always aware that much remains unknown and unknowable. But what we can see suggests a religious life of great richness and complexity, centered on powerful female deities, expressed through elaborate rituals, and intimately connected to the natural world. At the heart of Minoan religion stood the great goddess, or perhaps several goddesses whom scholars sometimes struggle to distinguish from one another. Unlike the male-dominated pantheons of most ancient civilizations, Minoan religious iconography is overwhelmingly female. Goddesses vastly outnumber gods in Minoan art. Female figures preside over religious ceremonies. Women serve as priestesses conducting sacred rituals. This prominence of the feminine divine suggests, though does not definitively prove, that Minoan society may have been matriarchal, or at least matrilineal, with women holding significant religious and possibly political power. The most famous representation of the Minoan goddess is the snake goddess figurine found at Knossos. This small faience sculpture, standing about a foot tall, depicts a female figure wearing the typical Minoan costume, a tight bodice exposing the breasts, a long flounced skirt, an elaborate headdress. In her outstretched hands, she grasps snakes, one in each hand, holding them firmly as they writhe upward. A small feline, perhaps a cat, sits atop her head. The symbolism is rich and multi-layered. Snakes, in ancient Mediterranean religions, often represented the earth, the underworld, regeneration, and renewal. They shed their skins and seem to be reborn, making them natural symbols of cyclical renewal. They live in the earth, connecting the surface world to the mysterious depths below. The goddess holding snakes suggests her power over these chthonic forces, her connection to the earth and its regenerative powers. But was this a single great goddess with many aspects, or were there multiple goddesses serving different functions? The evidence could support either interpretation. We see female deities associated with animals, suggesting a goddess of nature or mistress of beasts. We see goddesses with doves, birds that might represent messengers between earth and sky. We see goddesses in mountainous landscapes, perhaps representing mountain deities worshipped at peak sanctuaries. We see goddesses associated with trees, with pillars, with sacred symbols. Some scholars speak of the Great Mother, a supreme goddess of fertility and nature, who encompassed all these aspects. Others see evidence for multiple goddesses, a mother goddess, a harvest goddess, a goddess of the underworld, a protective household deity, each with distinct attributes and roles. The truth may lie somewhere between, with one primary goddess who manifested in different forms for different purposes, along with lesser deities serving specialized functions. What seems clear is that the Minoan conception of divinity was primarily feminine, associated with nature, fertility, protection, and the mysteries of life and death. The goddess, or goddesses, represented the life force itself, the power that brought growth and renewal, that sustained communities and individuals, that connected the human world to cosmic forces beyond human control. But divine power was not exclusively female in Minoan religion. Evidence suggests the existence of a young male god, perhaps a consort or son of the great goddess, who played an important role in Minoan religious life. This young god may have been associated with vegetation, dying each year like the crops and being reborn with the spring, a pattern familiar from other Mediterranean religions like the Egyptian Osiris or the Mesopotamian Tammuz. Some scholars have suggested that this young god was associated with bulls, those powerful animals that figure so prominently in Minoan iconography. If so, this would connect the male divine principle with strength, fertility, and the untamed power of nature. But the evidence remains fragmentary, and interpretations vary. What we can say with more confidence is that bulls held enormous sacred significance in Minoan religion. Bull imagery appears everywhere, in frescoes, on pottery, in sculpture, on seals. Bull horns, stylized into the distinctive shape called horns of consecration, marked sacred spaces throughout the Minoan world. These horns, carved from stone or molded in plaster, sat atop buildings, adorned altars, and designated areas where the divine presence was felt most strongly. The bull represented multiple things to the Minoans. It was a symbol of strength and vitality, of male fertility and power. Its horns suggested the crescent moon, connecting the bull to lunar cycles and the measurement of time. The bull's power could be both creative and destructive, embodying natural forces that sustained life, but could also threaten it. In the bull, the Minoans saw cosmic power made manifest, divine force taking animal form. The most dramatic expression of bull worship was the famous bull leaping ceremony, depicted so vividly in Minoan frescoes and carved on numerous seals and rings. In this extraordinary ritual, young athletes, both male and female, confronted charging bulls in what appears to have been a sacred performance of courage, skill, and perhaps spiritual significance. The mechanics of bull leaping, as depicted in Minoan art, seem almost impossible. An athlete grasps the horns of a charging bull. As the bull tosses its head upward, the athlete is lifted off the ground and uses the momentum to execute a somersault over the bull's back, landing behind the animal, where a second person stands ready to steady them. The timing would have to be perfect, the courage absolute, the physical skill extraordinary. Modern scholars debate whether the depictions are realistic or stylized, whether the acrobatics shown could actually be performed. Some experts in animal behavior and gymnastics suggest that the exact maneuvers shown in Minoan art might be impossible, that the bull's reaction to having its horns grasped would make the depicted somersault extremely difficult, if not unfeasible. Others point out that modern Spanish bullfighting includes athletic vaulting over bulls, though not in exactly the form shown in Minoan art, suggesting that some form of bull athletics was indeed practiced. Perhaps the Minoan artists idealized and stylized what they saw, showing not exactly what happened but a perfected vision of the ceremony. Or perhaps the athletes who performed this dangerous feat developed techniques we can no longer fully understand. What remains beyond doubt is that bull leaping held immense importance in Minoan culture. The frequency of its depiction, the care taken in rendering it artistically, the ceremonial context suggested by accompanying imagery, all indicate that this was no mere entertainment, but a sacred ritual. What did bull leaping mean religiously? Scholars have proposed various interpretations. Perhaps it was an initiation rite, with young people proving their courage and worthiness by confronting the sacred animal. Perhaps it was a ritual enactment of cosmic struggle, humans engaging with divine power in controlled but dangerous circumstances. Perhaps it represented the triumph of human skill and intelligence over brute natural force. Perhaps it was an offering to the deities, a demonstration of devotion through risk and excellence. Perhaps it symbolized the relationship between humanity and nature, a dance with danger that honored the bull's power while demonstrating human capability. The participation of both males and females in bull leaping is significant. Unlike many ancient societies that restricted ritual roles by gender, the Minoans seem to have allowed women to participate in this most dramatic and dangerous ceremony. The frescoes show female figures, identified by their white skin color following artistic convention, leaping over bulls alongside their male counterparts. This suggests a society with fewer gender restrictions than was typical in the ancient world, at least for certain elite individuals who participated in palace rituals. The risk inherent in bull leaping cannot be understated. Bulls are unpredictable, powerful animals. Attempting acrobatics around a charging bull would have been extraordinarily dangerous. Injuries must have been common. Deaths surely occurred. That the Minoans practiced this ceremony despite its dangers indicates how important it was to their religious life. They were willing to risk death to honor the divine, to participate in sacred mystery, to maintain the relationship between the human and divine realms. Minoan religious life extended far beyond the palace walls. Throughout Crete, the Minoans created sacred spaces in natural settings, believing that certain places in the landscape were especially holy, places where the divine could be encountered more directly. Peak sanctuaries, located on mountaintops and high hills, were among the most important of these natural sacred sites. At least 50 such sanctuaries have been identified across Crete. These were not elaborate structures but relatively simple stone enclosures and small buildings where worshippers came to make offerings and perform rituals. The locations were chosen for their dramatic settings, often commanding sweeping views over surrounding territories. Archaeological excavations at peak sanctuaries have recovered thousands of votive offerings, small figurines of humans and animals, double axes, pottery, jewelry. These offerings were left by worshippers, perhaps in gratitude for divine favor received, perhaps in petition for blessings desired. The figurines often show worshippers in poses of reverence, arms raised in salute or prayer, bodies bent in supplication. Some show deities or priests, others ordinary people seeking divine help. The act of climbing to these mountaintop sanctuaries was itself part of the religious experience. The physical effort required, the gradual separation from the everyday world as one ascended, the dramatic vistas opening up with each upward step, all created a sense of journeying toward the sacred. Arriving at the summit, breathless from the climb, surrounded by sky and distant views, worshippers must have felt they had entered a space between earth and heaven, a threshold where communication with the divine became possible. Sacred caves provided another natural setting for Minoan worship. Crete has hundreds of caves, and many show evidence of religious use in Minoan times. Like peak sanctuaries, caves were places where the boundary between human and divine seemed thinner, more permeable. But where peak sanctuaries reached upward toward sky and light, caves descended inward and downward toward earth and darkness. Caves connected to the underworld, to the mysterious forces beneath the surface of things. They offered access to chthonic powers, to deities of earth and fertility, to ancestors, perhaps believed to dwell in underground realms. Cave worship often focused on water, with many sacred caves containing springs or underground streams. Water, essential for life, emerging mysteriously from the depths of the earth, naturally suggested divine presence and power. The cave at Camares, where the distinctive pottery style was first discovered, served as a religious site for centuries. Worshippers climbed high into the mountainside to reach this cave, bringing offerings of pottery, figurines, and other goods. The cave at Psychro, traditionally identified as the birthplace of Zeus in later Greek mythology, shows evidence of Minoan worship and may preserve memories of much older religious practices. At the cave of Archelokori, archaeologists found hundreds of double axes, bronze weapons, and other metal objects, apparently deposited as offerings over many years. The double axe, or labris, was one of the most important and widespread sacred symbols in Minoan religion. This distinctive double-bladed axe appears throughout Minoan iconography, carved on pillars, molded in bronze, painted on pottery, incised on walls. Some double axes were functional weapons or tools. Others, cast in precious metals or carved from stone, were clearly ceremonial objects too delicate or valuable for practical use. The symbolism of the double axe has been much debated. Some scholars associate it with the goddess, noting that double axes often appear in contexts suggesting female divinity. Others see it as representing thunder or lightning, divine power manifest in nature. Still, others interpret it as a symbol of sacred authority, perhaps wielded by priestesses in religious ceremonies. The word labyrinth, used to describe the maze-like palace at Knossos, may derive from labris, suggesting a connection between the double axe and these complex buildings. Whatever its specific meaning, the double axe clearly marked sacred space and sacred action. Where you saw the double axe, you knew you were in the presence of the holy. It was a sign that demanded respect, that indicated boundaries between ordinary and sacred, that connected worshippers to divine power. Pillars and columns also held sacred significance beyond their architectural function. Pillar crypts, those underground chambers with massive pillars found in palace complexes, seem to have served religious purposes. The pillars themselves may have been seen as embodiments of divine presence, conduits between earth and sky, structures that both supported the physical building and connected the human and divine realms. Some pillars bear carved double axes, explicitly linking these architectural elements to sacred symbolism. Minoan religious ceremonies were elaborate, colourful affairs involving processions, music, dance, and offerings. The procession frescoes show us something of what these ceremonies looked like. Long lines of elegant figures, dressed in their finest clothes and jewellery, moved toward some sacred destination, carrying offerings, vessels, perhaps containing oil or wine, agricultural products, manufactured goods. Musicians accompany them, playing lyres and other instruments. The participants move with dignity and grace, part of a communal celebration that united the human community and honoured the divine powers that sustained them. Libations, the pouring out of liquids as offerings, played an important role in Minoan ritual. Special vessels called rhyta, often shaped like animal heads or decorated with religious imagery, were designed for pouring libations. The liquid, perhaps wine, perhaps oil, perhaps milk or honey, was poured onto altars or into special receptacles, offered to deities in ceremonies that might petition for favor or give thanks for blessings received. Animal sacrifice, common in most ancient religions, was probably practiced by the Minoans, though the evidence is less clear than for some other cultures. Some contexts suggest the ritual killing of animals, with their blood offered to deities and their meat consumed in communal feasts that followed religious ceremonies. Such sacrifices and feasts served multiple purposes, honoring the gods, cementing social bonds through shared eating, redistributing meat in societies where it was relatively scarce, and creating memorable events that marked important moments in the community's life. Dance appears frequently in Minoan religious iconography. Figures with arms raised, bodies turning, clearly engaged in rhythmic movement. Dance was prayer made physical, a way of communicating with divine forces through bodily motion. The repetitive movements, accompanied by music and perhaps by chanting or singing, could induce altered states of consciousness, allowing participants to feel they were transcending ordinary reality and entering sacred space where contact with the divine became possible. Some scholars have suggested that Minoan religious practices included the use of opium or other consciousness-altering substances. Opium poppies appear in Minoan art, and residues in some vessels suggest possible ritual use of opium. Whether these substances played a significant role in religious ceremonies remains uncertain, but the possibility reminds us that Minoan worship may have included ecstatic elements, experiences of divine possession or mystical union that transformed consciousness and created direct encounters with sacred power. The religious role of women in Minoan society appears to have been central and powerful. Priestesses conduct ceremonies in artistic depictions. Female figures preside over religious gatherings. The prominence of goddesses in the pantheon suggests that religious authority may have been primarily female. This doesn't necessarily mean Minoan society was matriarchal in the sense of women holding all political power, but it does suggest that women, or at least elite women, had access to forms of authority and prestige through religious roles that were unusual in the ancient world. The snake goddess figurines may represent priestesses rather than deities, women who took on the attributes of the goddess during ceremonies, channeling divine power through their bodies and actions. If so, this suggests a religion in which human and divine could merge temporarily, where priestesses became living embodiments of the goddess they served. But we must be careful not to overstate what we know. Minoan religion remains mysterious in its details. We can describe what we see in the archaeological record, the symbols, the sacred spaces, the ritual objects. But the beliefs that animated these practices, the prayers spoken, the myths told, the theological concepts that gave meaning to ritual action, these remain largely hidden from us. The Minoans believed something profound about the cosmos, about divine power, about humanity's relationship to forces greater than itself. But exactly what they believed, we can only dimly perceive through the veil of time and the silence of undeciphered writing. What we can say is that Minoan religion was rich, complex, and deeply integrated into every aspect of life. It centered on powerful female deities connected to nature and fertility. It honored the bull as a sacred animal embodying divine power. It created dramatic rituals like bull leaping that tested human courage and skill. It established sacred spaces in both built environments and natural settings. It involved elaborate ceremonies with processions, music, dance, and offerings. It gave women prominent religious roles unusual in the ancient world. And perhaps most significantly, Minoan religion seems to have been life-affirming rather than death-obsessed, focused on fertility and growth rather than warfare and conquest, celebrating beauty and nature rather than glorifying violence and domination. The Minoans, at least as their art presents them, worshipped powers that sustained life, that brought abundance, that made the world beautiful and fruitful. In their sacred world, as in their art and architecture, the Minoans created something distinctive, something that still speaks across the millennia of a people who found the divine in nature's beauty, in human courage, in the grace of dance and the power of ritual, in goddesses who blessed rather than terrorized, in ceremonies that celebrated life in all its wonder and mystery. Chapter 5. Daily Life and Society. We have walked through palaces, admired frescoes, contemplated religious mysteries, But what was it actually like to live as a Minoan? How did ordinary people spend their days? What did they wear? What did they eat? How did they work and love and raise their children? To truly understand this civilization, we must step down from the grand halls and sacred spaces into the everyday world where most Minoans lived their lives. Let us imagine a day in the life of Minoan Crete during the Neopalatial period, around 1600 BCE, when the civilization was at its height. Dawn breaks over the island. In a small farming village in the countryside south of Knossos, people are already stirring. The Mediterranean sun rises early in summer, and farmers wake with it to take advantage of the cooler morning hours before the heat becomes oppressive. A farmer named, let us say, Casto, though we do not actually know what names the Minoans used, rises from his sleeping mat. His house is modest but well built, with stone walls and a flat roof supported by wooden beams. The floor is packed earth, kept swept clean. There are several rooms, a main living area where the family gathers, sleeps, and eats, a storage room for food and equipment, perhaps a small courtyard open to the sky where cooking is done in good weather. Casto's wife has already started the day's work, grinding grain to make bread. She uses a saddle quern, a simple but effective stone tool consisting of a flat lower stone and a rounded upper stone that she rocks back and forth, crushing the grain between them. It is hard, repetitive work, but necessary. Bread is the staple food, eaten at every meal, the foundation of the Minoan diet. Their children are waking now. A daughter, perhaps 8 years old, begins helping her mother with household tasks. A son, younger, plays in the courtyard under his grandmother's watchful eye. The grandmother, too old for heavy work, still contributes by watching children, spinning wool, and passing on the knowledge accumulated over her decades of life. Casto dresses simply. In summer, men working outdoors wore little, a loincloth, sometimes supplemented by a codpiece for protection, and sandals to protect the feet from hot earth and sharp stones. In cooler weather, he might add a cloak. His clothing is practical, suited to physical labor in a warm climate. After a quick breakfast of bread, olives, and perhaps some cheese made from goat's milk, Casto heads to his fields. He grows wheat and barley on several plots of land scattered across the village territory. The grain is nearly ready for harvest, the stalks golden in the early morning light. But first, he must check on his olive trees. These valuable trees provide oil, the liquid gold of the Mediterranean world. Olive oil is used for cooking, for lighting lamps, for anointing the body, even as a form of wealth and trade currency. A grove of productive olive trees means prosperity. The trees are centuries old, gnarled and twisted, but still bearing abundant fruit. Casto examines them carefully, checking for signs of disease or pest damage. Satisfied, he moves to his vineyard. Grapes are another essential crop, providing both fresh fruit and, more importantly, wine. Wine is drunk at meals, used in religious ceremonies, and exported to foreign lands. A good grape harvest means a good year. Later in the morning, Casto and other village men gather to discuss collective work. The grain harvest is approaching, and everyone must help. In the village system, neighbors work together during critical agricultural periods, helping each other bring in the harvest, sharing labor and tools. This cooperation is essential in an agricultural society where timing is everything and labor needs fluctuate through the year. Meanwhile, in the palace at Knossos, a very different day is unfolding. A young woman named, let us call her Akasa, serves as an attendant to the palace priestesses. She comes from a good family, not the highest aristocracy, but respectable and connected. Her service in the palace brings honor to her family and offers her opportunities unavailable to village girls. Akasa's morning begins with careful attention to her appearance. Unlike the simple clothing of farmers, palace women dress elaborately. She puts on a long, flounced skirt, made from multiple tiers of fabric that create an elegant, flowing silhouette. The fabric is fine, possibly imported linen, dyed in expensive colors. Over this, she wears a fitted bodice that leaves her breasts exposed, following the Minoan fashion that seems shocking to modern sensibilities, but was apparently normal and proper in Minoan society. Her hair requires considerable attention. Minoan hairstyles were complex, with elaborate curls arranged in specific patterns. Akasa's hair, dark and thick, is arranged in ringlets that cascade down her back and frame her face. This takes time and often requires help from other women. Hair care is a social activity, women helping each other achieve the elaborate styles that mark elite status. Jewelry completes her outfit. Akasa wears gold earrings, a necklace of semi-precious stones, and bracelets on her wrists. These are not simply decoration but markers of status, indicators of her family's wealth and her position within the palace hierarchy. In her appearance, she embodies Minoan aesthetic values: elegance, grace, attention to detail, and appreciation of beauty. Her morning duties include preparing ritual objects for the day's ceremonies. She fills writer with oil for libations, arranges offerings of fruit and flowers on altars, ensures that the sacred spaces are clean and properly maintained. This work is considered honorable, service to the goddess and to the palace community. Akasa performs her tasks with care, knowing that proper execution of ritual matters both practically and spiritually. Around midday, a ceremony takes place in one of the palace shrines. Akasa assists the senior priestesses, handing them ritual implements, managing the offerings, ensuring everything proceeds smoothly. The ceremony involves chanting, the burning of incense, libations poured onto an altar, and prayers offered to the goddess. Though Akasa is young and junior in the religious hierarchy, she feels the power of these moments, the sense that through proper ritual, humans can touch the divine. After the ceremony, there is time for leisure. Akasa and other young palace women gather in a courtyard, talking and laughing. They discuss palace gossip, recent arrivals of foreign traders, upcoming festivals, relationships and flirtations. Despite the religious seriousness of their duties, they are young people enjoying life, finding pleasure in friendship and conversation. The palace itself is a bustling center of activity throughout the day. In the workshops, craftspeople are at work. Potters shape clay on their wheels, creating vessels that range from simple storage jars to elaborately decorated ceremonial pieces. The potter's wheel, a relatively recent innovation, allows for symmetrical, finely crafted vessels that would be impossible to make by hand. The potters are skilled professionals, their fingers knowing exactly how much pressure to apply, how to thin a wall, how to shape a spout or handle. Nearby, painters decorate the finished pottery. They use brushes made from animal hair or plant fibers, applying mineral pigments mixed with water. The designs flow from their brushes with confident strokes: spirals, flowers, marine creatures, geometric patterns. Some of these vessels will be used in the palace. Others will be traded abroad, carrying Minoan artistic sensibility to distant lands. In another workshop, textile workers are at their looms. Weaving is primarily women's work, though not exclusively. The vertical looms stand taller than the weavers, who pass shuttles back and forth, gradually building up fabric from threads. The textiles they create range from simple, sturdy cloth for everyday use to fine fabrics decorated with elaborate patterns. Some fabrics incorporate expensive dyes like purple from murex shells, creating luxury textiles for the elite or for export. Metalworkers labor in a separate area, where fire and forge create noise and heat. They cast bronze tools and weapons, hammer gold and silver into jewelry, carve intricate designs on seal stones. The skill required is immense. Metalworking involves understanding of temperatures, alloys, annealing, and finishing techniques. A master metalworker undergoes years of apprenticeship, learning secrets passed down through generations. Scribes work in quieter spaces, carefully inscribing linear A symbols onto clay tablets. They record deliveries to the palace, allocations of resources, inventories of goods in storage. This paperwork may seem mundane, but it is essential to palace administration. Without these records, the complex economic system centered on the palace could not function. The scribes are literate specialists, members of an educated elite who serve as the palace's administrative backbone. Food is a central concern for all Minoans, whether palace elite or village farmers. The Minoan diet was Mediterranean in character, based on the famous triad of grain, olives, and grapes, supplemented by vegetables, legumes, fruit, and modest amounts of meat and fish. Bread, as mentioned, was the dietary staple. Barley and wheat, ground into flour and baked, provided most calories for most people. The bread might be simple flatbreads or more elaborate loaves, depending on the occasion and the baker's skill. Olive oil was essential, used as a cooking fat, a condiment, and a source of calories and nutrition. The Minoans were expert olive cultivators, tending their groves carefully and processing the harvest into oil of high quality. Wine was the common beverage, typically diluted with water following Mediterranean custom. Undiluted wine was considered barbaric, the mark of someone without culture or self-control. Wine was stored in large jars and served in elegant cups during meals. Vegetables added variety and nutrition. Lentils and chickpeas provided protein. Onions, garlic, and various greens seasoned dishes and provided vitamins. Fruit included figs, grapes, and pomegranates. Honey, the only sweetener available, was precious and used sparingly. Meat was relatively rare, expensive, and associated with special occasions. When animals were slaughtered, it was often in religious contexts, with the meat then distributed and consumed in communal feasts. Sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle all provided meat, but most of these animals were more valuable alive for their wool, milk, or labor than as food. Fish and seafood, more common for those living near the coast, supplemented the diet and provided variety. The palace residents ate better than village farmers, with access to imported delicacies, more frequent meat, and greater variety. But even farmers could generally feed themselves adequately. Crete was fertile, the climate favorable, and agricultural techniques reasonably sophisticated. Famine was not unknown, but in good years, food was adequate and sometimes abundant. Children grew up learning the skills they would need as adults. Boys accompanied fathers and uncles to fields and workshops, learning by observation and practice. A farmer's son learned when to plant and harvest, how to tend animals, how to maintain tools and equipment. A craftsman's son learned his father's trade, beginning with simple tasks and gradually taking on more complex work as his skill developed. Girls learned from mothers and grandmothers. They learned to grind grain, bake bread, spin thread, weave cloth, manage households, prepare food, and raise children. For elite girls like Akasa, education might include religious training, learning the rituals and law necessary for service in palace shrines. Play was part of childhood, though we know little of specific Minoan games. Children everywhere invent games, play with toys, explore their world through imagination. Minoan children probably played with simple toys, dolls, balls, perhaps miniature animals carved from wood or clay. They ran, climbed, swam in the sea, explored the countryside, and gradually learned the patterns and rhythms of adult life. Adolescence brought transitions. Young people took on adult responsibilities, began contributing more substantially to family and community economy, and thought about marriage and establishing their own households. For some, coming of age may have involved rituals like bull leaping, tests of courage that marked the transition from childhood to adulthood. Marriage united families as much as individuals. Arrangements were made between families, considerations of status and property playing important roles. We do not know the details of Minoan marriage customs, but in most traditional societies, marriage is too important to be left entirely to individual choice. Young people might have input, but families and communities had interests to consider. Women's status in Minoan society appears to have been relatively high compared to many ancient civilizations. Their prominence in religious art, their participation in ceremonies, their apparent freedom of movement and action, all suggest a society that gave women respect and agency, but we should not romanticize. Ancient societies were hierarchical and often harsh by modern standards. Women, even respected women, faced constraints and expectations that limited their options. Still, by Bronze Age standards, Minoan women seem to have enjoyed considerable status and influence. As evening approaches, work winds down. The farmer returns from his fields, tired but satisfied with the day's accomplishments. The palace craftspeople clean their tools and secure their workshops. Families gather for the evening meal, the day's main occasion for communal eating and conversation. Meals are social events. Families sit together, sharing food and talk. Stories are told, news exchanged, plans made. The elderly share their knowledge and experience. Children learn family history and cultural traditions. These evening gatherings strengthen bonds, transmit culture, and create the sense of continuity that holds communities together across generations. As darkness falls, oil lamps are lit, their flames providing gentle illumination. The Minoans did not have artificial light as we know it. When the sun set, darkness came, broken only by fires and oil lamps. This meant that most activities occurred during daylight hours, with evening time for rest, conversation, and sleep. In the palace, evening might bring entertainment, music, dancing, storytelling. Musicians play lyres, flutes, and percussion instruments. Singers entertain with songs we can no longer hear, telling stories of gods and heroes, of love and loss, of the great events and small moments that make up human life. For the palace elite, evening is a time of pleasure and refinement, enjoying the fruits of civilization. In the village, evening is quieter but no less meaningful. Families sit together in the fading light, enjoying the cool air after the day's heat. Neighbors visit, maintaining the social connections that make village life function. Grandparents tell stories to grandchildren, passing on the accumulated wisdom and myth of generations. And then, sleep. The Minoans slept on woven mats or simple beds, covering themselves with wool blankets if the night was cool. They slept soundly, tired from physical labor, rising again with the sun to repeat the cycle. This was daily life for the Minoans. Work and rest, ritual and routine, the pleasures and challenges of existence in a Bronze Age civilization. Their lives were not so different from other pre-modern peoples, yet distinctively Minoan in their aesthetic sophistication, their religious practices, their social structures, and their connection to the sea and the wider Mediterranean world. They lived, they worked, they loved, they raised children, they worshipped their gods, they created beauty, they died and were mourned and remembered. They were human, fully human, and in their humanity, they achieved something remarkable, a civilization that balanced practical necessity with aesthetic refinement, religious devotion with worldly prosperity, tradition with innovation. For a time, for those few centuries of the Neopalatial period, the Minoans lived well, their society functioning smoothly, their culture flourishing. But as we shall see, even successful societies face challenges, and the Minoans were about to encounter forces that would test their civilization to its very foundations. Chapter 6. The THERAN Eruption. Catastrophe. 110 kilometers north of Crete, across the shimmering waters of the Mediterranean, rises the island known to the ancient Greeks as Thera and to us today as Santorini. In the 17th century BCE, this island looked very different from the crescent-shaped fragment of land we see today. It was larger, more circular, a prosperous island that supported a thriving Minoan settlement at a place called Akrotiri on its southern coast. Beneath the pleasant surface, however, Thera concealed terrible power. The island was volcanic, part of the volcanic arc that curves through the southern Aegean Sea. For centuries, it had slept quietly, allowing human settlement to flourish on its slopes. But beneath the earth, in chambers of unimaginable heat and pressure, magma was accumulating, building toward a release that would reshape the geography of the region and send shockwaves through the Minoan world. The story of the THERAN eruption is the story of natural catastrophe intersecting with human civilization, of forces beyond human control, impacting societies that had grown comfortable and confident. It is a reminder that even successful civilizations exist at the mercy of the natural world, that all human achievement can be threatened by the planet's raw power. Let us follow this disaster as it unfolded, understanding both what happened and, perhaps more importantly for our story, what it meant for the Minoans. The people living on Thera in the decades before the eruption had created a prosperous settlement. Akrotiri was essentially a Minoan town, with architecture reflecting Cretan models, pottery in Minoan styles, frescoes depicting Minoan life and customs. The houses were well built, some rising 3 stories high, with sophisticated drainage systems and comfortable living spaces. The residents engaged in fishing, farming, and trade, taking advantage of their island's position along Mediterranean shipping routes. Life seemed secure, permanent. Families invested in their homes, decorating walls with beautiful frescoes. Merchants stored goods in their warehouses. Children grew up expecting to inherit a world much like their parents. The future stretched ahead, predictable and promising. But the earth had other plans. Sometime around 1600 BCE, though the exact date remains debated, seismic activity began to increase. Small earthquakes rattled the island, nothing catastrophic but enough to cause concern. Cracks appeared in buildings. Some structures suffered minor damage. The residents, experienced with the occasional earthquake common in this geologically active region, repaired the damage and continued their lives. But the earthquakes did not stop. They came more frequently, more intensely. Buildings that had been repaired were damaged again. Some people began to worry, to wonder if this was more than the usual seismic activity. And then, perhaps, there were other signs. Springs and wells might have changed their behavior, becoming unusually hot or releasing strange gases. Animals might have behaved oddly, sensing disturbances humans could not yet perceive. At some point, the residents of Akrotiri made a crucial decision. They would evacuate. Perhaps religious authorities declared the signs inauspicious. Perhaps community leaders judged the risk too great. Perhaps individual families simply decided to seek safety elsewhere. Whatever the specific reasons, the people of Akrotiri left their town. They left in an organized manner, not panicked flight. They took their valuables, their jewelry, their portable wealth. They removed important possessions from their homes. But they left behind the heavy, immovable things: furniture, large storage jars, the architecture itself, the frescoes on the walls. They must have hoped to return, to reclaim their homes and resume their lives once the danger passed. They never returned. Shortly after the evacuation, the volcano exploded with unimaginable violence. The eruption of Thera was one of the largest volcanic events in recorded history. Volcanologists classify it as a Plinian eruption, named after Pliny the Younger, who described the eruption of Vesuvius that destroyed Pompeii. But the THERAN eruption was larger, far larger. It ejected somewhere between 30 and 60 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere, roughly 4 times the volume expelled by the famous Krakatoa eruption of 1883 CE. The eruption unfolded in stages over hours or perhaps days. Initially, a column of ash and pumice shot skyward, rising tens of thousands of feet into the atmosphere. This column, superheated and expanding rapidly, climbed higher and higher, visible for hundreds of miles, a pillar of destruction connecting earth to sky. As the eruption continued, the column began to collapse. Pyroclastic flows, avalanches of superheated gas and rock fragments, raced down the volcano's slopes at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. These flows, with temperatures reaching 700 degrees Celsius or more, incinerated everything in their path. They rushed across the island of Thera, burying Akrotiri and other settlements under meters of volcanic material. The pyroclastic flows did not stop at the shoreline. They continued across the water, their momentum carrying them across the sea surface in a terrifying display of nature's power. Some flows may have reached nearby islands, though the evidence for this remains debated. As enormous volumes of magma were expelled from beneath Thera, the volcano's summit lost support. The ground began to collapse, falling inward into the evacuated magma chamber below. This collapse, known as caldera formation, created the distinctive shape that Santorini has today, a crescent of islands surrounding a deep, water-filled depression. The island had literally fallen in on itself, its center dropping hundreds of feet. The collapse triggered massive tsunamis. Walls of water, tens of meters high, radiated outward from Thera in all directions. These waves traveled at immense speed across the Mediterranean, carrying devastating energy toward distant shores. The ash plume spread across the eastern Mediterranean and beyond. Winds carried volcanic ash hundreds of miles from the source. A layer of ash fell across the region, covering Crete, the Aegean Islands, coastal Anatolia. Ships at sea found themselves in darkness at midday, ash falling like deadly snow. The sky darkened, the sun obscured by the volcanic cloud. For those who witnessed it from a distance, the eruption must have been terrifying beyond comprehension. The sky itself seemed to be dying, light giving way to unnatural darkness. Thunder roared continuously from the volcanic explosion. The ground shook with distant earthquakes. And then, hours after the eruption began, the tsunamis arrived. On Crete, 110 kilometers south of Thera, the Minoans watched the northern sky darken with dread. The enormous eruption column was visible from Crete, a towering pillar of ash and destruction. Even at that distance, The sound must have been audible, a deep, continuous roar that spoke of power beyond human scale. Then came the ash. Fine volcanic particles began to fall across northern Crete, covering roofs, fields, and pathways with a grey blanket. The ash was not immediately lethal, but it was disturbing, a physical manifestation of the catastrophe occurring to the north. It contaminated water sources. It coated vegetation. It made breathing difficult. It fell for hours, accumulating to depths of several centimeters in some areas. But the greatest immediate threat came from the sea. The tsunamis generated by Thera's collapse swept southward toward Crete. When they reached the island's northern shore, they struck with tremendous force. Coastal settlements bore the brunt of the impact. Waves perhaps 10 to 15 meters high, some estimates suggest even higher, crashed over beaches and harbors, flooding low-lying areas, destroying buildings near the shore, smashing boats and port facilities. At Amnisos, the port serving Knossos, archaeological evidence shows tsunami damage. Buildings were destroyed. The harbor area was devastated. Lives were certainly lost, though we cannot know how many. Other coastal sites show similar evidence of violent destruction by water. However, and this is crucial, the damage was largely confined to the immediate coastal zone. The major palace centers, including Knossos, Phaistos, and Malea, all located inland and on higher ground, were not directly destroyed by the tsunamis. The palace at Zakros, on the eastern coast, may have suffered more damage due to its coastal location, but even there, the destruction was not total. The ash fall, while concerning, was not catastrophic for Crete's agriculture. The layer deposited on the island was relatively thin, several centimeters at most. This could damage crops in the short term, but would not render the land infertile. Indeed, volcanic ash, after it weathers, can actually enrich soil with minerals. So the immediate physical damage to Crete from the THERAN eruption, while certainly significant, was not civilization ending. The Minoans survived the catastrophe. Their major centers remained intact. Their population, though surely affected, was not destroyed. Archaeological evidence shows clearly that Minoan civilization continued after the eruption, even flourished for a time. But survival is not the same as being unaffected. The THERAN eruption had profound impacts that extended far beyond the immediate physical destruction. The psychological impact must have been immense. The Minoans had just witnessed nature's power on a scale that dwarfed human achievement. Their largest buildings, their most impressive palaces, were insignificant compared to the forces that had destroyed an entire island. The sky had darkened. The earth had shaken. The sea had risen in violent waves. For a people whose religion centered on natural forces, these events surely carried religious significance. Did they interpret the eruption as divine anger? As a warning from the gods? As a sign that the relationship between humanity and the divine had been disrupted? We cannot know for certain, but the appearance of what archaeologists call crisis cults in the period following the eruption suggests religious uncertainty and attempts to restore cosmic balance through ritual. The economic impacts rippled outward from the immediate disaster. Thera itself was gone, its population scattered, its role in trade networks eliminated. The Cycladic islands suffered various degrees of damage. Maritime trade routes were disrupted, at least temporarily. Ships were lost. Ports were damaged. The carefully constructed commercial networks that connected the Aegean had been violently interrupted. For Crete, so dependent on maritime trade, this disruption had serious consequences. Even if the physical damage was limited, the breakdown of trade relationships, the loss of trading partners, the uncertainty about conditions in other regions, all of these created economic stress. Recovery from such disruption takes time, and during that time, normal commercial activity is impossible. The agricultural impact, while not immediately catastrophic, may have been significant over time. The ashfall, combined with possible climate effects from the massive amount of material injected into the atmosphere, could have affected growing conditions. Volcanic eruptions can cause temporary cooling by blocking sunlight, leading to shorter growing seasons and reduced crop yields. If the eruption occurred in spring or summer, it could have damaged that year's harvest, creating food shortages. There is also the question of Minoan settlements in the Cyclades. If the Minoans had colonies or trading posts on islands near Thera, these would have been destroyed or severely damaged. The loss of these outposts would have reduced Minoan reach and influence in the Aegean, opening opportunities for competitors, particularly the rising Mycenaean civilization on mainland Greece. Modern scholars have long debated the role of the THERAN eruption in Minoan decline. For many years, it was believed that the eruption directly caused the collapse of Minoan civilization. This theory was appealing in its simplicity. Massive natural disaster destroys advanced civilization. It seemed to explain why the palaces fell and why Mycenaean Greeks came to dominate Crete. But the evidence doesn't support this simple narrative. Archaeological dating shows that the eruption occurred around 1600 BCE, while the destruction of most Minoan palaces occurred around 1450 BCE, more than a century later. There's a significant time gap between the eruption and the collapse. Moreover, as we've noted, the immediate physical damage to Crete was limited. The major palaces survived the eruption intact. In fact, the archaeological record shows something surprising. After the THERAN eruption, Minoan civilization experienced a remarkable period of prosperity and cultural achievement. The post-eruption phase of the Neopalatial period, roughly 1600 to 1450 BCE, saw ambitious building projects, flourishing international trade, and the creation of some of the finest Minoan art, including the marine-style pottery we discussed earlier. So, if the eruption didn't immediately destroy Minoan civilization, what was its role? The current scholarly consensus is more nuanced. The THERAN eruption weakened Minoan civilization without destroying it. It disrupted trade networks, damaged coastal settlements, created economic stress, and perhaps shook confidence in the religious and social order. The Minoans recovered, but the recovery may have left them vulnerable in ways that wouldn't become apparent for decades. Think of it like a serious illness. A healthy person suffers a severe disease, survives, but is left weakened. They may seem to recover fully, resuming normal activities. But internally, damage has been done. When new challenges arise, perhaps challenges they could have easily handled before, they lack the reserves of strength to cope. The illness didn't kill them directly, but it contributed to their eventual decline. The THERAN eruption may have functioned similarly for Minoan civilization. It demonstrated the fragility of their world. It disrupted systems that had seemed stable and permanent. It created memories of disaster that would not be forgotten, and it may have weakened the civilization's resilience just enough that when new threats emerged, a century later, the Minoans could not withstand them. There's another aspect of the THERAN eruption worth considering: its role in mythology and memory. Some scholars have suggested that the eruption and the destruction of the prosperous settlement at Akrotiri may have contributed to the legend of Atlantis, the advanced civilization that supposedly sank beneath the waves in a single day and night. Plato, writing in the 4th century BCE, more than 1,000 years after the THERAN eruption, told the story of Atlantis, a powerful island civilization beyond the Pillars of Hercules that was destroyed by the gods for its hubris. Most scholars consider Atlantis a philosophical invention, a cautionary tale Plato created to make points about politics and virtue. But perhaps embedded in the story are distorted memories of real events. An advanced island civilization suddenly destroyed, disappearing beneath the sea. The anger of the gods. These elements match, in broad outline, what happened to Thera. Memories of the eruption could have been passed down through generations, becoming mythologized over time, eventually reaching Plato's ears in garbled form. Whether or not the THERAN eruption inspired the Atlantis legend, the disaster certainly entered into collective memory. The Greeks of classical times knew that catastrophic volcanic eruptions had occurred in the deep past. The physical evidence, the changed geography of the Cyclades, the buried settlements, all testified to ancient disaster. These memories may have shaped Greek thinking about hubris and divine punishment, about the precariousness of human achievement in the face of natural and divine forces. For the Minoans who lived through the THERAN eruption and its aftermath, life continued, but with a new awareness of vulnerability. They rebuilt damaged structures. They restored trade connections. They continued their religious ceremonies, perhaps with added fervor, seeking to maintain good relations with the powerful deities who controlled nature's forces. The palaces continued to function. Art continued to develop. Ships continued to sail. For more than a century after the eruption, Minoan civilization endured, even flourished in many ways. The creative spirit that had built such beauty was not extinguished by volcanic ash and seismic waves, but the world had changed. The confidence of the early Neopalatial period, the sense that the Minoans had mastered their environment and secured their prosperity, had been shaken. They knew now that disaster could strike without warning, that the earth itself could turn against them, that all their achievements existed at the mercy of forces beyond their control. And in mainland Greece, the Mycenaeans were watching, learning, growing stronger. They had seen Minoan vulnerability. They had profited from the disruption of Minoan trade. They were developing their own palaces, their own art, their own ambitions. They were a warrior people, more aggressive than the Minoans, less content to prosper through trade and cultural influence alone. The stage was being set for the next chapter in our story, a chapter not of natural disaster, but of human violence, not of volcanic eruption, but of invasion and conquest. The THERAN eruption had shaken Minoan civilization. What came next would break it. But that is a story for our next chapter. For now, we leave the Minoans rebuilding from catastrophe, demonstrating the resilience that had allowed their civilization to endure for nearly 2,000 years, creating beauty even in the shadow of destruction, living as humans always have, with hope and determination, facing an uncertain future with whatever strength they could muster. Chapter 7. The Mycenaean Takeover. While Crete rebuilt from the THERAN catastrophe across the sea to the north, on the mainland of Greece, a different kind of civilization was emerging. The Mycenaeans, named after their greatest stronghold at Mycenae in the Peloponnese, were developing a culture that would eventually rival and surpass the Minoans themselves. The Mycenaeans were, in many ways, cultural descendants of the Minoans. They had learned from Crete, adopting Minoan artistic styles, borrowing architectural techniques, absorbing religious concepts. In their early development, the Mycenaeans were essentially students of Minoan civilization, importing Cretan goods, hiring Minoan craftspeople, emulating the sophistication they saw across the southern sea. But the Mycenaeans were also fundamentally different from the Minoans in temperament and values. Where the Minoans built open palaces without fortifications, the Mycenaeans constructed massive citadels surrounded by walls of enormous stone blocks. Where Minoan art celebrated nature and religious ceremony, Mycenaean art glorified warriors and warfare. Where the Minoans seemed content with cultural and commercial influence, the Mycenaeans sought military power and territorial expansion. This difference would prove decisive. The story of Minoan civilization's end is, in large part, the story of Mycenaean ascendancy, of a more aggressive culture supplanting a more peaceful one, of warriors overcoming merchants and priests. The Mycenaean civilization began to crystallize around 1700 BCE, roughly contemporaneous with the Minoan Protopalatial period. Initially, the mainland Greeks lived in relatively simple settlements, nothing to match the sophistication of Crete. But the famous shaft graves at Mycenae, dating to around 1600 BCE, show sudden wealth and sophistication appearing in mainland culture. These graves contained gold masks, bronze weapons inlaid with precious metals, jewelry of remarkable craftsmanship, and luxury goods imported from across the Mediterranean. The amount of wealth, the martial character of the grave goods, the emphasis on weaponry and warrior status, all suggest a society organized around military prowess and headed by a warrior aristocracy. Where did this wealth come from? Possibly from raiding and piracy, activities the Mycenaeans seem to have practiced extensively, possibly from controlling trade routes and extracting tribute or tolls, possibly from serving as mercenaries for wealthier civilizations. However it was accumulated, the wealth funded the development of an increasingly sophisticated and powerful culture. The Mycenaeans learned from the Minoans, but adapted what they learned to suit their own values. They built palaces, but on hilltops and surrounded by massive fortification walls. The walls at Mycenae, Tiryns, and other citadels were constructed from enormous limestone blocks, some weighing several tons, fitted together without mortar in what later Greeks called Cyclopean masonry, believing only mythical giants could have moved such stones. These fortifications tell us something essential about Mycenaean society. They lived in fear of attack, or perhaps they themselves were the attackers and expected retaliation. Either way, defense was paramount. The peaceful, open architecture of Minoan Crete was foreign to Mycenaean thinking. Security came from thick walls and defensible positions, from military strength rather than diplomatic relationships. By 1500 BCE, Mycenaean civilization was fully formed and expanding. Multiple palace centers existed across mainland Greece: Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Athens, Thebes. These centers competed with each other, but shared a common culture, a common language, and common architectural and artistic styles. They were, collectively, becoming a significant power in the Aegean world. The relationship between the Mycenaeans and Minoans during the 15th century BCE appears to have been complex. Trade certainly occurred. Minoan goods are found in Mycenaean contexts, and Mycenaean pottery appears on Crete. Cultural exchange continued, with influence flowing in both directions, though still primarily from the more sophisticated Minoans to the developing Mycenaeans. But there were signs of changing power dynamics. Mycenaean pottery began to compete with Minoan wares in foreign markets. Mycenaean traders operated across the Mediterranean, challenging Minoan commercial dominance. Egyptian tomb paintings from this period show foreign emissaries who seem to be Mycenaean rather than Minoan, suggesting the mainland Greeks were establishing their own diplomatic relationships with Eastern Mediterranean powers. On Crete itself, there are hints of Mycenaean presence during the later Neopalatial period. Some pottery shows Mycenaean influence. Certain artifacts appear more mainland than Cretan in character. Whether this represents peaceful cultural exchange, the presence of Mycenaean merchants or craftspeople in Crete, or something more ominous, remains debated. What is clear is that by 1450 BCE, something dramatic happened. Archaeological evidence shows widespread, deliberate destruction across Crete. Palaces and elite residences were systematically burned. Not all sites suffered equally. The pattern of destruction is selective, but the damage was extensive and clearly intentional. At the site of Myrtos Pyrgos in southeastern Crete, excavations show that most of the settlement survived, but the house of the local ruler was deliberately destroyed by fire. At Palikastro and Moklos, important ritual buildings were demolished. At sites across the island, buildings associated with elite power and religious authority suffered targeted destruction. The palace at Phaistos was destroyed. Mallia burned. Zakros fell. Across Crete, the centers of Minoan power and culture were attacked. The destruction was not random, not the result of earthquake or accidental fire. This was violence, deliberate and systematic, aimed at breaking Minoan power. Knossos, interestingly, was spared the worst of the destruction. The town around the palace burned, but the palace itself survived largely intact. This selective destruction suggests military action with specific strategic goals rather than indiscriminate devastation. Who was responsible? The archaeological evidence points strongly to the Mycenaeans. The timing coincides with Mycenaean expansion. The pattern of selective destruction matches military conquest rather than natural disaster. And what happened after the destruction makes Mycenaean involvement virtually certain. Following the destructions of 1450 BCE, Crete changed fundamentally. The most revealing evidence comes from the palace at Knossos, which continued to function as an administrative center, but under new management. Linear B tablets appear at Knossos after 1450 BCE. Linear B, unlike the still undeciphered Linear A, was deciphered in 1952 by Michael Ventris and proved to be an early form of Greek, specifically Mycenaean Greek. The presence of Linear B tablets at Knossos means Greek speakers were now running the palace administration. The content of these tablets reinforces this conclusion. They record inventories, rations, and administrative details in Greek. Many of the personal names recorded are Greek, particularly those holding positions of administrative and military authority. The tablets dealing with military matters show predominantly Mycenaean names among commanders and officials. The tablets also reveal changes in administrative practice. The record-keeping system, while building on Minoan traditions, shows Mycenaean innovations and priorities. More attention is paid to military equipment and personnel. The overall impression is of a palace administration that has been taken over and reorganized by Greek-speaking Mycenaeans. The art at Knossos during this final palace period also changes. New frescoes are painted, but their style shifts. The earlier Minoan love of nature and flowing, organic forms gives way to more rigid, formal compositions. Figures become stiffer, less graceful. Military themes appear: shields, weapons, processions of tribute bearers. The iconography becomes more similar to that found in Mycenaean palaces on the mainland. Bulls remain important in the imagery, suggesting continuity of religious symbolism, but they're presented differently, with more emphasis on power and domination rather than the dynamic interactions seen in earlier Minoan bull-leaping scenes. The sacred remains sacred, but the interpretation has shifted. Throughout Crete, burial practices change in the later 15th century. Warrior graves appear, containing weapons and armor of Mycenaean type. Chamber tombs, typical of Mycenaean burial customs, begin to replace earlier Minoan forms. The dead are now being laid to rest according to mainland Greek customs rather than traditional Cretan practices. All of this evidence points to a clear conclusion. After 1450 BCE, Crete came under Mycenaean control. The exact nature of this control, whether direct military occupation or more subtle political domination, remains debatable. But that Greeks from the mainland now ruled Crete is essentially certain. How did this happen? The archaeological evidence shows destruction and conquest, but the specific historical events remain unknown. We have no written accounts from either the Mycenaeans or the Minoans describing what occurred. We must reconstruct the story from material remains and make our best guesses about the human drama behind the archaeological data. Perhaps the conquest was gradual, with Mycenaean influence increasing over time until it culminated in military takeover. Perhaps it was sudden, a coordinated invasion that overwhelmed Minoan defenses. Perhaps internal conflicts on Crete created opportunities for Mycenaean intervention, with mainland Greeks supporting one faction against another and ultimately seizing control themselves. The survival of Knossos while other palaces fell might suggest collaboration. Perhaps the rulers of Knossos allied with the Mycenaeans, helping to eliminate rival palace centers in exchange for their own survival under Mycenaean overlordship. This would explain the selective pattern of destruction and the continuation of Knossos as an administrative center. Or perhaps Knossos held out longer, surviving the initial wave of destruction before eventually falling under Mycenaean control. Archaeological evidence shows that Knossos was finally destroyed around 1375 BCE, more than 70 years after the other palaces fell. This later date might mark the final conquest of the last Minoan holdout. Whatever the specific sequence of events, the result was clear. Minoan independence ended. For the first time in nearly 2,000 years, Crete was ruled by foreigners, by mainlanders who spoke a different language and held different values. But conquest is never total. Cultures are resilient, and local traditions persist even under foreign domination. The Mycenaeans controlled Crete politically and militarily, but Minoan culture survived, blending with Greek culture to create a hybrid civilization. Minoan religious practices continued, though perhaps adapted to Mycenaean beliefs. The goddess worship that had been central to Minoan spirituality persisted, influencing Greek religion and contributing to the later Greek pantheon. Some scholars suggest that goddesses like Athena, Artemis, and Demeter have roots in Minoan deity concepts. Minoan artistic traditions influenced Mycenaean art. Even as the Mycenaeans imposed their own styles and subjects, they absorbed Minoan aesthetic sensibilities. The beauty of Minoan art, its celebration of nature and grace, left its mark on Greek artistic development. Minoan architectural knowledge passed to the Mycenaeans. The sophisticated building techniques, the understanding of hydraulics and engineering, the appreciation of light and space, all of these became part of the Mycenaean building tradition and ultimately influenced classical Greek architecture. The ordinary Cretan population, the farmers and craftspeople, the priestesses and merchants, they continued their lives under new rulers. They still spoke their language, though increasingly they learned Greek as well. They still practiced their crafts, though perhaps now under Mycenaean direction. They still worshipped at their shrines, though the old ways were changing. For them, the conquest meant new masters, new demands, new restrictions. But life went on. Fields still needed planting. Olives still needed harvesting. Children still needed raising. The fundamental patterns of agricultural life persisted regardless of who held political power. The Mycenaean period on Crete lasted for roughly 2.5 centuries, from 1450 to around 1200 BCE. During this time, Crete was part of a larger Mycenaean world that stretched across the Aegean. Knossos remained an important center, though no longer the unique power it had been. It was now one palace among many in a system centered on the mainland. Trade continued, though perhaps redirected through Mycenaean channels. Crete still produced agricultural goods, pottery, textiles, but the island's role in Mediterranean commerce diminished as Mycenaean centers on the mainland took over many commercial functions previously held by Minoan Crete. The cultural flowering of the Neopalatial period was over. No longer did Cretan artists create the vibrant frescoes and elegant pottery that had characterized Minoan civilization at its peak. The creative spirit, while not extinguished, was constrained, redirected, subordinated to Mycenaean priorities and tastes. Yet Minoan influence persisted in subtle ways. The Mycenaeans, even as conquerors, respected much of what the Minoans had achieved. They preserved some palaces, maintained some religious sites, allowed continuation of some traditions. They were not simply destroyers but also inheritors, taking what they could use from the conquered civilization and making it part of their own. This is the pattern of cultural contact throughout history. Conquerors absorb elements from the conquered. The supposedly superior military power learns from the culturally sophisticated society it dominates. Rome conquered Greece militarily, but was conquered culturally by Greek civilization. The same dynamic played out in Bronze Age Crete. Around 1200 BCE, another wave of destruction swept across the Mediterranean. The entire Bronze Age world system collapsed in what historians call the Late Bronze Age collapse. Mycenaean palaces on the mainland were destroyed. Trade networks broke down. Populations declined. Literacy was lost in many regions. The causes remain debated, a complex mix of factors including climate change, crop failures, migrations of peoples, internal rebellions, and the mysterious sea peoples mentioned in Egyptian records. Crete did not escape this wider catastrophe. Knossos was finally abandoned. Other sites fell into ruin. The palace system that had organized Cretan society for 1,000 years came to an end. The Bronze Age was over. In the chaos, new peoples arrived on Crete. The Dorian Greeks, speaking a different dialect from the Mycenaeans, settled across the island around 1100 BCE. They brought their own customs, their own social organization, their own way of life. Crete entered the Iron Age, a new era that would eventually lead to the classical Greek civilization we know from history. The Minoan civilization was gone. The palaces lay in ruins. The frescoes faded and crumbled. The Linear A tablets, their language never to be read, became archaeological curiosities. The great cultural achievement of Bronze Age Crete passed into obscurity, remembered dimly in Greek myths and legends, but lost as historical reality. For 3,000 years, the Minoans would remain buried, their existence forgotten, their achievements unknown. The world moved on, unaware that Europe's first civilization had once flourished on a Mediterranean island, creating beauty and prosperity before falling to conquest and being swallowed by time. But buried is not the same as destroyed. The stones remained, waiting. The frescoes, though damaged, survived in places. The artifacts endured in the earth. And in 1900, Arthur Evans would begin to dig, and the Minoans would return to human awareness, their story ready to be told again to a world that had forgotten them. The conquest by the Mycenaeans marked the end of Minoan independence, but not the end of Minoan influence. Their legacy passed into Greek civilization, shaping the culture that would eventually dominate the Mediterranean and provide foundational elements for Western civilization itself. In defeat, the Minoans achieved a kind of immortality, their achievements absorbed and transmitted by their conquerors to future generations. Chapter 8. The Mystery of the Collapse. We have told the story of Minoan decline as a narrative of volcanic catastrophe followed by Mycenaean conquest. But the true story, as scholars have discovered through decades of careful research and debate, is considerably more complex and uncertain than any simple narrative can capture. The end of Minoan civilization remains one of archaeology's enduring mysteries, a puzzle with pieces that don't quite fit together, questions that have multiple possible answers, and debates that continue to this day. Let us step back now and examine what we actually know, what we think we know, and what remains frustratingly unclear about how and why Minoan civilization fell. In doing so, we enter the realm where archaeology meets interpretation, where evidence encounters theory, where facts give way to informed speculation. This is the nature of studying the deep past. We have fragments, traces, shadows of what once was. From these incomplete remains, we must reconstruct human stories, understanding always that our reconstructions are provisional, subject to revision, as new evidence emerges, or new interpretations challenge old assumptions. Let us begin with what the archaeological evidence actually shows, stripped of interpretation and narrative. Around 1600 BCE, the volcanic island of Thera erupted catastrophically. Ash from this eruption is found in layers across the eastern Mediterranean. On Crete, this ash layer is detectable but relatively thin. Some coastal sites show evidence of tsunami damage. However, the major Minoan palace centers show no signs of destruction at this time. They continued to function, and in fact, the period following the eruption saw considerable building activity and artistic production. Around 1450 BCE, roughly 150 years after the THERAN eruption, widespread destructions occurred across Crete. Many palaces and elite residences were burned. The destruction was selective, some sites destroyed while others nearby survived. The pattern suggests deliberate, targeted violence rather than natural disaster. Following these destructions, Linear B tablets appear at Knossos, indicating Greek-speaking Mycenaean administration. Archaeological finds show increasing Mycenaean cultural influence across the island. Around 1375 BCE, Knossos itself was destroyed. After this, palace culture on Crete effectively ended. Some settlements continued, but the elaborate palace-centered civilization that had characterized Minoan Crete was finished. Around 1200 BCE, as part of the wider Late Bronze Age collapse affecting the entire eastern Mediterranean, the Mycenaean palace system also fell. Crete entered a period of decline and depopulation before eventually being resettled by Dorian Greeks around 1100 BCE. These are the basic facts, the things we can say with reasonable confidence based on archaeological evidence. But facts alone don't explain. They don't tell us why these things happened or what they meant to the people who experienced them. For that, we need interpretation, and interpretation is where scholarly disagreement begins. The oldest and simplest theory blamed the THERAN eruption for Minoan collapse. This theory had dramatic appeal. Massive natural disaster destroys advanced civilization. It fit popular imagination and seemed to explain everything in one catastrophic event. The Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos, excavating at Amnisos in the 1930s, found evidence of tsunami damage and proposed that the THERAN eruption and its resulting tsunamis had destroyed Minoan civilization. The theory gained widespread acceptance and captured public imagination. It even inspired suggestions that Minoan Crete was the historical basis for Plato's Atlantis legend. But as more evidence accumulated, this simple theory became untenable. The chronology didn't work. The eruption occurred around 1600 BCE, but the major palace destructions dated to 1450 BCE. That's a gap of 150 years, far too long for direct causation. Moreover, as excavations continued, it became clear that the Neopalatial period after the eruption was actually a time of considerable prosperity and cultural achievement, not decline. The physical damage from the eruption, while real, was limited. Coastal areas suffered tsunami damage, but inland palaces were unaffected. The ashfall was measurable but not devastating. Crops might have been damaged in the eruption year, but agricultural recovery would have been relatively quick. Most scholars now reject the volcanic catastrophe theory as a direct cause of Minoan collapse. The eruption certainly affected Minoan civilization, disrupting trade, damaging settlements, creating psychological and perhaps religious crisis. But it didn't destroy Minoan civilization. The Minoans survived and even thrived for more than a century after Thera exploded. The Mycenaean invasion theory has stronger support. The evidence for Mycenaean takeover around 1450 BCE is substantial. The destructions at that time, the appearance of Linear B, the changes in material culture, all point to conquest by mainland Greeks. But even here, questions remain. Was this a sudden, coordinated invasion, or a gradual process of Mycenaean infiltration culminating in political takeover? Were the destructions the result of Mycenaean military action, or were there civil conflicts on Crete that the Mycenaeans exploited? Why did Knossos survive when other palaces fell? Did its rulers collaborate with the Mycenaeans? Or did they successfully defend themselves for a time? Some scholars have suggested that the Mycenaeans didn't invade Crete militarily, but rather took advantage of Minoan weakness following some other crisis. Perhaps earthquakes damaged Minoan defences. Perhaps internal political conflicts divided Cretan society. Perhaps economic problems created instability. The Mycenaeans, seeing opportunity, moved in to fill a power vacuum rather than conquering a strong, unified civilization. The selective pattern of destruction supports this more complex scenario. If the Mycenaeans were conducting a straightforward military conquest, why spare some sites while destroying others? The pattern suggests political complexity, factional conflicts, selective targeting based on who resisted and who collaborated. Another possibility is that what we're seeing is civil war among Minoans themselves, perhaps with Mycenaean mercenaries or allies fighting on one side. The destructions might represent one Minoan faction attacking another, with the Mycenaeans eventually emerging as the dominant power amid the chaos. This would explain why the violence was selective and why Knossos, the likely winner in such a conflict, survived. Some scholars have proposed that internal factors weakened Minoan civilization before any external threats materialized. Several possibilities have been suggested. Environmental stress might have played a role. Overexploitation of resources, deforestation, soil erosion. These processes could have gradually undermined the agricultural base that supported Minoan civilization. As productivity declined, competition for resources intensified, social tensions increased, and political stability eroded. Climate change is another possibility. Tree ring data and other climate proxies suggest periods of drought and cooling during the late Bronze Age. If Crete experienced prolonged drought or unseasonable weather patterns, agricultural yields would have suffered. Food shortages could have led to social unrest, weakening the palace system from within. Overpopulation might have strained resources. If Crete's population had grown beyond what the island could comfortably support, any environmental stress would have been magnified. Societies living at the edge of their carrying capacity have little resilience when faced with additional challenges. Economic factors could have contributed. If Minoan trade networks were disrupted, perhaps by competition from Mycenaean merchants, perhaps by political instability in Eastern Mediterranean trading partners, the palace economies dependent on trade would have suffered. Economic decline could have undermined the palace system's ability to maintain its administrative and religious functions. Social tensions might have been building. The palace system concentrated wealth and power in elite hands. If this concentration increased over time, if inequality became more extreme, resentment among those excluded from palace benefits might have grown. Social revolution, uprising from below, could explain some of the palace destructions. None of these internal factor theories are fully convincing on their own, but they remind us that civilizations rarely collapse from a single external shock. Usually, decline results from multiple factors interacting, internal weaknesses making societies vulnerable to external threats. The most likely explanation is that Minoan collapse resulted from a combination of factors, each contributing to overall vulnerability. The THERAN eruption, while not immediately catastrophic, disrupted trade networks, damaged coastal infrastructure, and created psychological trauma. The eruption demonstrated vulnerability, shook confidence in the religious and social order, and perhaps initiated economic decline that would take decades to fully manifest. Environmental and climate factors may have stressed agricultural production, reducing the surplus that supported palace economies. Even minor reductions in productivity, sustained over years, could have significantly weakened the system. Internal, social, and political tensions may have been building, creating divisions that external enemies could exploit. If palace authority was being questioned, if alternative power centers were emerging, if different regions of Crete were competing rather than cooperating, the unified strength that had characterized earlier Minoan civilization would have been compromised. And then the Mycenaeans, strong, ambitious, and militarily aggressive, saw opportunity. Whether through outright invasion, political manipulation, or exploitation of civil conflict, they moved to dominate Crete. The weakened Minoans, unable to mount unified resistance, fell under Mycenaean control. This multi-causal explanation is less dramatic than a single catastrophic event, but it's probably closer to historical reality. Civilizations rarely fall from one cause. They decline through complex processes involving multiple factors over extended periods. The spectacular collapse we observe archaeologically is usually the final manifestation of problems that had been developing for decades or longer. What makes the Minoan collapse particularly intriguing is how much remains genuinely unknown. We don't know what the Minoans themselves thought was happening. We can't read their own accounts of these events because we can't decipher linear A. We don't know what prayers they offered, what explanations their priests provided, what political debates occurred as crisis approached. We don't know the human stories behind the archaeological evidence. Who made the decision to abandon Akrotiri before the eruption? What arguments occurred in palace councils as Mycenaean influence grew? Who resisted the Mycenaean takeover? And who collaborated? What did it feel like to watch a civilization that had endured for nearly 2,000 years begin to crumble? These human dimensions of the collapse remain beyond our reach. We have the material remains, the destroyed buildings, the changed pottery styles, the linear B tablets, recording administrative details in a foreign language. But the lived experience of collapse, the individual and collective trauma of civilizational ending, these are lost to us. Perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps some historical experiences are so profound, so painful, that they deserve to remain private, unobserved by the curious eyes of scholars 4,000 years later. The Minoans lived through the end of their world. They experienced it in ways we can never fully comprehend. We can study what they left behind, but we cannot truly know what they felt. New discoveries continue to refine our understanding. Excavations uncover new evidence. Scientific techniques allow more precise dating and analysis. DNA studies reveal information about population movements and relationships. Climate data provides context for environmental factors. Each new piece of evidence potentially changes our interpretation. Perhaps someday linear A will be deciphered, and we'll finally hear Minoan voices speaking directly about their world and its ending. Perhaps new excavations will reveal clearer evidence of what happened around 1450 BCE. Perhaps technological advances will allow analysis we cannot yet imagine. The mystery of Minoan collapse is not fully solved. It may never be. But the continuing investigation, the patient accumulation of evidence, the careful construction and testing of theories, this is how we honor the past. We may never know complete truth, but we can approach ever closer to it, and in the process, we keep the memory of the Minoans alive. They built something extraordinary. They saw it fall. They experienced trauma and loss that we, comfortable in our modern world, can scarcely imagine. They deserve our attempt, however imperfect, to understand what happened to them and why. They deserve to be remembered not just as archaeological artifacts, but as people, as a civilization that achieved greatness and then, like all civilizations eventually must, came to an end. Chapter 9. The Legacy. The palaces fell. The frescoes faded. The linear A tablets, their messages forever unread, were buried in the rubble of collapsed buildings. For 3,000 years, the Minoans vanished from human memory, their civilization forgotten, their very existence unknown to the world that came after them. But forgotten is not the same as gone. Lost is not the same as without influence. For even as Minoan civilization disappeared from conscious memory, its legacy persisted, woven into the fabric of Greek culture, embedded in myths and legends, preserved in artistic traditions and religious practices, shaping the very foundations of Western civilization in ways both subtle and profound. The story of the Minoans does not end with their fall. In some ways, it was only beginning. For what they created, what they achieved, what they believed and built and imagined, these things had a life beyond the civilization that gave them birth. The Minoans may have fallen, but their influence endured, transmitted through the Mycenaeans to classical Greece, and from Greece to Rome, and from Rome to the wider Western world. Let us trace this legacy, following the threads that connect Bronze Age Crete to our own time, understanding how a civilization lost for millennia nonetheless shaped the world we inhabit today. The most direct transmission of Minoan culture came through the Mycenaeans themselves. Even as conquerors, the Mycenaeans recognized the sophistication of what they had overcome. They absorbed Minoan artistic techniques, adopted religious practices, incorporated architectural knowledge, and preserved cultural elements that suited their needs. Minoan religious concepts profoundly influenced Greek religion. The goddesses who dominated Minoan worship did not disappear with Minoan civilization. They transformed, evolved, and emerged in the later Greek pantheon. Many scholars believe that major Greek goddesses have Minoan origins. Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare, patron of Athens, may have roots in a Minoan palace goddess. Her association with snakes, her role as protector of cities, even her iconography showing her in elaborate dress, all echo Minoan goddess imagery. The later Greeks remembered Athena as particularly ancient, suggesting consciousness that her worship predated the classical period. Artemis, goddess of wild nature and animals, seems to reflect the Minoan mistress of beasts, that goddess shown commanding lions and other creatures. Artemis's association with wilderness, her role as protector of young women, her connection to Crete in Greek mythology, all point toward Minoan origins. Demeter, goddess of grain and harvest, mother mourning her daughter Persephone, likely descends from Minoan mother goddess concepts. The Eleusinian mysteries, among the most important religious rites in classical Greece, may have preserved elements of Minoan, agricultural, and fertility rituals. Even Zeus, the Greek sky father and king of gods, had Cretan connections. The Greeks themselves said Zeus was born in a cave on Crete, hidden from his father Kronos, raised by nymphs and protected by divine guardians. This tradition, placing the birth of Greece's chief god on Crete, suggests memory of Crete's religious importance in the deep past. The Minoans worshipped their deities in sacred caves and on mountaintops. The Greeks continued these practices, maintaining cave sanctuaries and peak shrines. The religious geography of Bronze Age Crete influenced classical Greek sacred landscape. Places the Minoans had considered holy remained holy for the Greeks who came after. Sacred symbols persisted as well. The double axe, so important in Minoan iconography, appears in later Greek contexts, particularly in Crete. The horns of consecration, marking sacred space in Minoan architecture, echo in later Greek religious symbolism. These visual continuities speak to cultural transmission across the civilizational boundary. Greek mythology preserved distorted memories of Minoan civilization. The stories of King Minos, the Minotaur, Theseus, Ariadne, Daedalus, and Icarus, all these familiar tales from Greek myth, are set on Crete and seem to contain fragments of historical memory wrapped in legendary narrative. King Minos himself, described as a great lawgiver and ruler, may preserve memory of Minoan kingship or palace authority. The Greeks remembered Minos as powerful and connected to the gods, specifically to Zeus. This mythological Minos ruled from Knossos, exactly where the greatest Minoan palace actually stood. The Minotaur, that creature half human and half bull, dwelling in a labyrinth beneath the palace, surely reflects the Minoan obsession with bulls and the maze-like complexity of Minoan palaces. When Arthur Evans excavated Knossos and encountered its bewildering corridors and passages, he understood immediately why later Greeks would remember it as a labyrinth. The bull-leaping ceremonies, dangerous rituals involving young people and sacred bulls may have been transformed in Greek memory into the story of youths sent as tribute to be devoured by the Minotaur. Theseus, the Athenian hero who entered the labyrinth and slew the Minotaur, perhaps represents Greek memory of Athens' relationship with Minoan Crete. The story tells of Athens paying tribute to Crete, sending young people to serve the Minotaur until Theseus ended this servitude by killing the monster. This could be mythologized memory of Minoan power over the Greek mainland during the Neopalatial period, and of that power's eventual overthrow, perhaps by Mycenaean Greeks from Athens or other mainland centers. Ariadne, daughter of Minos who helps Theseus escape the labyrinth, might represent Minoan assistance to the Greek takeover. The detail of her giving Theseus a thread to find his way through the maze could symbolize Minoan knowledge or cultural guidance provided to the Mycenaeans. Daedalus, the master craftsman who built the labyrinth and later escaped Crete with artificial wings, represents Greek memory of Minoan technical and artistic excellence. The Greeks remembered that their Cretan predecessors were master builders and craftspeople. Daedalus embodies this recognition, though transformed into individual mythological genius. The fall of Icarus, who flew too close to the sun on wings made of feathers and wax, might represent Greek understanding of Minoan overreach, of a civilization that achieved great heights but ultimately fell. Like many myths, it contains moral lessons drawn from historical memory. These myths, told and retold through generations, kept alive some memory of Minoan civilization even after specific historical knowledge was lost. The Greeks of the classical period didn't know they were remembering real Bronze Age history, but they preserved the memory nonetheless, wrapped in story form. Minoan artistic influence flowed into Mycenaean art, and from there into the artistic traditions of archaic and classical Greece. The grace and naturalism that characterize Greek art, the attention to human form and movement, the love of organic, flowing lines, these aesthetic values have Minoan roots. The Greek appreciation for beautiful objects, for fine craftsmanship, for art that serves both functional and aesthetic purposes, echoes Minoan values. While Greek art developed its own distinctive character, particularly in sculpture where the Greeks eventually surpassed all predecessors, the foundation included elements inherited from Minoan artistic tradition. Greek architecture also shows Minoan influence, though again filtered through Mycenaean intermediaries. The use of columns as architectural and aesthetic elements, the organization of space around central courtyards, the integration of painting with architecture through frescoes, all have precedence in Minoan building practice. The Minoan column, tapering downward, thicker at the top than the bottom, didn't survive into classical Greek architecture. But the fundamental principle, that columns can be both structural support and decorative element, that architecture should please the eye, as well as serve practical function, this understanding passed from Minoan Crete to classical Greece. Beyond specific artistic or religious elements, the Minoans demonstrated something more fundamental, that European civilization was possible. They proved that Europeans could create complex societies, sophisticated art, extensive trade networks, systems of writing and administration. They showed that civilization was not exclusively the achievement of the Near East or Egypt, but could emerge in Europe as well. This matters more than might be immediately obvious. Classical Greece is often presented as the beginning of European civilization, the source from which all later European culture flows. But Greek civilization didn't emerge from nothing. It had predecessors, and chief among them were the Minoans. The Minoans were Europe's first literate civilization, the first to build monumental architecture, the first to create extensive maritime trade networks, the first to develop complex political and economic organization. They demonstrated possibilities that later Europeans, including the Greeks, would build upon and expand. In showing what was possible, the Minoans helped shape what would eventually become. They created a model, even if that model was not consciously followed. They proved that European peoples could achieve cultural sophistication equal to any in the world. The rediscovery of the Minoans in the 20th century created new appreciation for Bronze Age achievement and complicated our understanding of European prehistory. Before Arthur Evans began excavating at Knossos, the narrative of European civilization began with classical Greece. The Bronze Age was dimly known, understood mostly through Homer's epic poems, which themselves were viewed more as mythology than history. Evans's discoveries changed that understanding fundamentally. Suddenly, Europe had a deep prehistory of civilizational achievement. The Greeks themselves had predecessors. The story of European civilization needed to be rewritten, pushed back 1,000 years to account for the Minoans. This discovery influenced 20th century art, literature, and thought. Artists and writers drew inspiration from Minoan imagery. The mysterious, sophisticated, seemingly peaceful Minoans captured modern imagination. They seemed to offer an alternative vision of civilization, one less militaristic, more aesthetic, more connected to nature and goddess worship than the patriarchal warrior cultures that dominated much of later history. Feminist scholars found in Minoan civilization evidence that ancient societies could elevate women to positions of religious and possibly political power. Whether or not Minoan society was truly matriarchal remains debated, but the prominence of goddesses and priestesses in Minoan religion suggested possibilities different from the male-dominated religions and societies that characterized most of recorded history. Environmentalists saw in Minoan art a civilization that celebrated nature rather than seeking to dominate it. The dolphins and flowers, the sacred groves and mountain sanctuaries suggested a culture that understood itself as part of the natural world rather than separate from or superior to it. Modern Crete takes pride in its Minoan heritage. The palace at Knossos is a major tourist attraction, visited by hundreds of thousands of people each year. Minoan imagery appears in Cretan hotels, restaurants, and shops. The Minoans have become part of modern Cretan identity, a source of pride and connection to a glorious past. For archaeologists and historians, The Minoans represent an enduring research frontier. New excavations continue. Analytical techniques improve. Debates about interpretation persist. The attempt to decipher Linear A continues, with each generation of scholars bringing new approaches to this stubborn problem. The Minoans keep revealing new aspects of their civilization, surprising researchers, refusing to fit neatly into theories and categories. What, then, is the ultimate legacy of the Minoans? What did they give to the world that endures beyond their own time? They gave beauty. The frescoes and pottery, the graceful architecture and elegant jewelry, these objects still move us, still speak across 4,000 years of their creators' aesthetic vision and love of beauty. They gave technical knowledge. Their achievements in engineering, particularly in hydraulics and architecture, contributed to the accumulated wisdom that later civilizations built upon. They gave religious concepts, their goddess worship, their sacred symbols, their understanding of the divine in nature. These ideas influenced Greek religion, and through it, the wider Mediterranean world. They gave the foundation for Greek civilization. Without the Minoan precedent, without their demonstration of what was possible, Greek civilization might have developed very differently. The Minoans created cultural capital that the Greeks inherited and developed. They gave us a reminder of civilization's fragility. Their fall, whether from natural disaster, invasion, internal collapse, or some combination of factors, demonstrates that even successful civilizations can end. Nothing is permanent. All human achievement exists within time, subject to forces beyond complete human control. They gave us mystery. The undeciphered script, the unknown language, the gaps in our knowledge, these remind us that the past is not fully recoverable, that some things remain forever beyond our reach. This mystery invites continued inquiry, continued attempts to understand, continued respect for what remains unknown. Most fundamentally, the Minoans gave evidence of human capacity for creating beauty and meaning, for organizing complex societies, for living in ways that balanced practical necessity with aesthetic and spiritual fulfillment. They showed that human beings, working together, can create civilizations that endure for millennia and leave legacies that outlast even their own existence. The palaces are ruins now, slowly crumbling despite conservation efforts. The frescoes continue to fade, their colors less vibrant with each passing year. The artifacts sit in museums, separated from the lives they once served. But the Minoan achievement persists in memory, in scholarship, in cultural influence, in the inspiration they provide to all who encounter their story. They lived, they built, they created, they fell, but they are not forgotten. And as long as we remember them, study them, tell their story, they retain a kind of existence, a presence in human consciousness that transcends their physical disappearance. This is the legacy of the Minoans, a civilization that proved Europe could create sophisticated culture, that influenced all that came after, that left behind beauty and mystery, and that reminds us of both human achievement and human fragility. They were here. They mattered. They deserve to be remembered. Chapter 10. Closing. Reflections. The sun is setting over Crete once again, as it has for millions of years, as it did when the Minoans walked these hills and sailed these waters. The light catches the stones of ancient ruins, warming them one last time before darkness comes. The Mediterranean breeze, carrying the scent of wild thyme and salt air, whispers through empty corridors where priestesses once walked, where craftspeople once labored, where children once played. If you visit Knossos today, you can stand in the central courtyard and look around at the reconstructed columns painted their distinctive red, at the remaining fragments of frescoes, at the stone throne where someone important once sat 4,000 years ago. You can walk through the magazines where enormous storage jars still stand. You can climb the grand staircase and imagine light streaming down through the light well. You can touch stones that Minoan hands shaped and placed. The reconstruction is controversial. Arthur Evans used modern materials, concrete and paint, to recreate what he imagined the palace looked like. Some archaeologists criticize this, arguing that he mixed ancient and modern in ways that confuse rather than clarify, that his vision reflected his own early 20th century assumptions rather than Bronze Age reality. But stand there anyway, in that courtyard, under that Mediterranean sun. Close your eyes, and try to imagine. The courtyard filled with people in elaborate costumes, the sound of music, the chanting of prayers, the smell of offerings burning on altars, the sight of processions moving with dignity and purpose. Young people preparing for the dangerous dance with sacred bulls, priestesses invoking goddesses whose names we will never know. Open your eyes again. The courtyard is empty now, except for tourists with cameras, archaeological students making notes, guides explaining the site to visitors. The past is gone, accessible only through imagination, informed by scholarship, by the careful study of what remains. And yet, something persists. Not just the stones, though they endure, solid and real. Not just the artifacts in museums, though they too survive, beautiful and mysterious. Something less tangible persists, something essential. The fact that they were here, that they tried, as all humans try, to make meaning from existence. That they created beauty, organized society, worshipped their gods, raised their children, loved and mourned, and hoped and feared. Throughout this long night's journey through Minoan history, we have encountered many mysteries. The language they spoke, forever locked in undeciphered symbols. The exact nature of their government, whether ruled by kings or councils or priestess queens. The specific beliefs they held about the cosmos, the gods, life and death. The details of daily life, the conversations people had, the jokes they laughed at, the songs they sang. These mysteries will likely remain. Linear A may never be deciphered. The voices of the Minoans may never speak directly to us. We may forever see them through the distorting lens of archaeology, inferring belief from material culture, guessing at meaning from silent stones. Perhaps this is as it should be. Perhaps some aspects of human experience should remain private, unknowable to later generations. The Minoans lived their lives, experienced their joys and sorrows, faced their challenges, and celebrated their triumphs. They did not live to become objects of study for people 4,000 years in the future. They lived for themselves, in their own moment, as we all do. We honor them not by claiming to fully understand them, which would be arrogant presumption, but by recognizing their humanity, by acknowledging that they, like us, sought meaning and beauty, security and transcendence. We honor them by telling their story as best we can, admitting the limits of our knowledge while celebrating what they achieved. What can we take from the Minoan story, we who live in such a different world, so far removed from Bronze Age Crete? What wisdom does their experience offer to those of us navigating our own times? Perhaps we can learn humility. The Minoans built a civilization that lasted nearly 2,000 years, far longer than any modern nation has yet existed. They created beauty that still moves us. They developed technologies that were advanced for their time. And yet, they fell. Their palaces became ruins. Their language was forgotten. Their very existence faded from memory. If the Minoans could fall, so can we. If their achievements could crumble into dust, so can ours. This is not cause for despair, but for humility, for recognition that all human creation exists within time, subject to change and eventual transformation. Perhaps we can learn to value beauty. The Minoans could have decorated their pottery with military scenes, as the Mycenaeans did. They could have covered their walls with images of kings smiting enemies. They chose instead to paint dolphins and flowers, elegant courtiers and sacred ceremonies. They created beauty for its own sake, because beauty matters, because it enriches life. Perhaps we can learn about resilience. The Minoans faced earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, conquests. They rebuilt. They adapted. They persisted for centuries, finding ways to continue even when disaster struck. Human societies are resilient, capable of enduring challenges that seem overwhelming. Perhaps we can learn that civilizations are fragile. The balance required to maintain complex society, the conditions necessary for prosperity, the careful web of relationships and systems and beliefs that hold communities together, all of this is more delicate than it appears. What seems permanent can dissolve. What seems strong can prove vulnerable. Perhaps we can simply learn to appreciate what humans can achieve. The Minoans, with Bronze Age technology, with no electricity or computers, with no modern science or machinery, created something extraordinary. They remind us of human capacity, of what people can accomplish when they work together with vision and dedication. The night deepens over Crete. Stars emerge in the clear Mediterranean sky, the same stars the Minoans watched 4,000 years ago. The ruins are dark now, silent, empty, but in our minds, we can light them up again. We can people these empty spaces with Minoans going about their lives. We can imagine the palaces as they were, vibrant with colour, alive with activity. We can hear the music they made, the prayers they offered, the conversations they shared. This is the power of historical imagination, of scholarship joined with empathy. We cannot truly bring the past back. The Minoans are gone, as all humans eventually must go. But we can remember them. We can study what they left behind. We can honour their memory by telling their story, by recognising their achievements, by acknowledging that they mattered. The Minoans were Europe's first civilization. They built the first palaces, wrote the first European scripts, created the first sophisticated art, established the first extensive trade networks. They worshipped goddesses and leapt over sacred bulls. They painted dolphins swimming through painted seas. They engineered plumbing systems and architectural wonders. They lived and loved and created and died on an island in the Mediterranean 4,000 years ago. They deserve to be remembered. And now, having spent this time together walking through their world, you will remember them. You carry their story now, these people who created something beautiful before falling to forces beyond their control, these humans who lived long ago but who remain, in memory, alive. Sleep well, knowing that the Minoans, though forgotten for 3,000 years, have returned to human awareness. Their palaces, though ruined, still stand. Their art, though faded, still inspires. Their story, though incomplete, still teaches. The sun will rise tomorrow over Crete, as it always has, warming ancient stones, illuminating ruins that testify to human achievement and human fragility, reminding those who visit that we are part of a long human story, that those who came before us mattered, that what we create may endure beyond our time, and that the attempt to build something beautiful and meaningful is itself worthwhile, even if, eventually, all falls to dust. The Minoans tried. They succeeded for nearly 2,000 years, and then they passed, as all things pass, into history, into memory, into the long story of human civilization on this ancient earth. Rest well. Their story is told. May it bring you peace and understanding, and dreams of dolphins swimming through painted seas under Mediterranean skies. Good night.